Alright everyone, tonight we are diving headfirst into one of the most entertainingly unhinged chapters of human social history, the world of Georgian courtship. We are talking about love, desire, and the agonizingly slow march toward marriage in an era defined by powdered wigs, rib-crushing corsets, and a flirtation system so elaborate it practically needed its own instruction manual. Go ahead and forget everything you think you know from costume dramas. Forget the soft candlelight, the perfectly coiffed hair, and the whispered declarations of undying devotion. Actual Georgian courtship was a spectacularly bizarre ritual involving sweat-drenched gloves, painfully mediocre love poetry, chaperones who operated with the energy of parole officers on double shifts, and marriage negotiations conducted alongside discussions of livestock and land acreage. Before we get into it, if you enjoy what we do here, hit that like button and subscribe. Only if you genuinely mean it, though. A massive thank you to the viewer who suggested we explore this topic tonight. Your suggestions genuinely shape what ends up on this channel, and that means everything. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Also, quick note, we are now available on Spotify as well, so if you'd rather listen while drifting off to sleep, the link is waiting for you in the description. Now settle in, maybe flip on a fan for some background noise, and let's ease into this together. Let's stop for just a moment. Have you ever genuinely wondered what the experience of dating was like when you were legally and socially prohibited from being alone in the same room as the person you were about to marry? When a glimpsed ankle was essentially the Georgian equivalent of extremely suggestive content. When writing someone a letter was emotionally equivalent to showing up outside their window holding a speaker blasting love songs. How did people even manage to get engaged when everyone in the vicinity smelled like damp wool soaked in rosewater that had gone slightly off? Could you endure a courtship where your own mother was negotiating the details of your future husband's annual income before she would even allow him to sit beside you at dinner? What if you happened to hate dancing? What if your teeth had staged a quiet rebellion and abandoned your mouth before your wedding day arrived? What if the man being presented to you as a prospective husband turned out to be, plot twist of the century, your own cousin? Could you survive an entire season of eligible bachelors circling your family's fortune like seagulls eyeing a dropped sandwich? Would your reputation survive the devastating scandal of laughing too loudly in a public setting? Congratulations, because you have just woken up in the year 1780. You are wearing an outfit that outweighs you by a considerable margin. Your hair has developed its own microclimate, and somewhere on the floor below you, your father is currently sizing up a man with questionable dental hygiene and £3,000 a year. Best of luck. Let's begin. Part 1, the marriage market. You are not a person, you are a portfolio. Let's start with the foundational, deeply uncomfortable truth at the center of Georgian courtship. It was not at its core about love. It was about contracts. It was about acreage. It was about dowries and family bloodlines, and which grandmother happened to be friends with which other grandmother. The moment you reached what we would today consider a perfectly normal and deeply awkward adolescence, you ceased to be merely a young person. You became inventory. Your family did not look at you and see someone with dreams and inner depth. They saw a negotiating asset wrapped in silk, and they intended to put that asset to work. Welcome to the marriage market, where the merchandise is human, the pricing structure is deliberately confusing, and returns are absolutely not accepted under any circumstances. For young women, the timeline was genuinely brutal. By around 16 or 17, you were expected to be polished and ready for public display. If you rolled into your early 20s without having secured a husband, concerned murmuring would begin circulating at tea gatherings. By your mid-20s, the vocabulary of the era had a specific and grim term for you. You were on the shelf. By 30, unmarried and without realistic prospects, society had essentially filed you away into permanent storage, where you would spend the remainder of your days as someone's spinster aunt, politely tolerated, quietly pitied, and eventually deployed as an unpaid governess for other people's children. Think of it as agging out of a dating app, except the dating app is the entirety of your social world, and the algorithm determining your fate is your own mother. For men, the pressure was real but differently structured. A man could wait, often did wait, much longer. Plenty of gentlemen didn't bother getting married until their 30s or even 40s, once they had inherited estates, advanced in their chosen professions, or simply gotten around to the whole business. Men had the extraordinary luxury of time. Women did not. This fundamental asymmetry shaped every single social interaction that followed. A woman at 19 was in her prime promotional window. A man at 35 was just warming up. The entire system ran on information, and that information was anything but subtle. Everyone in a given social circle knew precisely how many acres your father controlled, how many sisters you had to split the family money with, whether your grandfather had died wealthy or merely well-connected, and crucially, whether there was any documented history of mental instability in your family line. Mothers maintained mental databases of eligible bachelors that would genuinely impress a modern HR department. Fathers discussed financial settlements over port after dinner. Young people were displayed at social gatherings the way prize horses were paraded at county fairs, and with roughly the same level of personal input into their own destinies. Even your physical presentation was part of the calculation. Good teeth were a genuine selling point, because by your 30s, most people had lost several. Clear skin was prized because smallpox scars were widespread and visible. A pleasant singing voice could tip the scales in your favor. The ability to sit completely still for 3 hours while being evaluated by strangers was essentially a baseline requirement. You were not expected to be fascinating. You were expected to be presentable, adequately refined, and vaguely musical. Here is the particularly rich irony. Everybody understood this was the operating system, and everybody maintained the fiction that it wasn't. The appearance of romance was preserved at considerable effort. Poems were composed, flowers exchanged, meaningful glances stolen across crowded rooms, but lurking behind every dewy-eyed declaration of affection was a lawyer somewhere with a quill calculating financial settlements. It was essentially modern dating, except instead of your date casually mentioning their salary, their accountant showed up for dessert to review your combined financial projections. The Georgians simply skipped the pretense of keeping these conversations separate and did everything simultaneously. So there you stand, corseted to the edge of breathlessness, smiling at strangers in a room that smells vaguely of sweat layered beneath lavender, and you are not here as a person tonight. You are a portfolio, and someone across the room is about to make an offer. Part 2, the season, the Hunger Games, but with fans. Every spring, the wealthier families of England packed up their enormous trunks, their monumental wigs, and their crushing expectations, and descended upon London for what was known as the season. Picture an extraordinarily well-dressed competition where the weapons are folding fans and the prize is an engagement ring, or at least the promise of one. The season ran roughly from late winter through early summer, and it was a relentless carousel of balls, private dinners, opera performances, and garden parties, all designed to ensure that young people of appropriate social standing could encounter one another, quietly assess each other's prospects, and ideally agree to legally bind themselves together for the remainder of their natural lives. The logistics alone was staggering. Moving an entire aristocratic family from a country estate into a rented London townhouse was not a casual weekend endeavor. It involved dozens of packed trunks, multiple carriages, servants traveling ahead to prepare the house, other servants traveling behind to handle whatever had been forgotten, and a truly extraordinary quantity of luggage containing outfits that would each be worn precisely once. An unmarried daughter preparing for the season might require 15 evening gowns, 12 morning dresses, riding habits, walking costumes, opera wraps, and appropriate footwear for every single occasion. Repeating an outfit at any significant event was considered something approaching personal tragedy. The social calendar was punishing. A typical week during peak season might include 3 or 4 balls running until 2 in the morning, a private concert, an afternoon of paying calls on acquaintances, a trip to the opera, a formal dinner party, a morning ride through Hyde Park, and some form of additional evening engagement. Sleep was considered optional. Afternoon napping was standard practice and entirely necessary for survival. because fainting at a ball was genuinely career-ending on the social circuit. Imagine running a marathon every single day while wearing a wedding cake. Now sustain that for 4 consecutive months. The geography of the season was also highly specific and unforgiving. You had to be seen in the correct locations at the correct times. Hyde Park in the afternoon was for walking or driving, a space where families might casually encounter one another and exchange carefully calibrated greetings. Olmec's assembly rooms on Wednesday evenings represented the absolute pinnacle of social legitimacy. Getting through the door required vouchers from a committee of notoriously terrifying patronesses who could turn you away for wearing technically incorrect trousers. And yes, wearing trousers instead of the required knee breeches actually got a future prime minister turned away at the entrance. That is the specific level of petty we are working with here. The financial cost was staggering. A single season could easily consume a substantial portion of a family's annual income once you calculated the townhouse rental, the wardrobe expenses, the carriage maintenance, the servants' wages, the entertaining costs, and the endless small fees of simply existing within fashionable London. Families routinely went into serious debt funding their daughters' seasons, gambling that the investment would eventually pay off in the form of an advantageous marriage. Someone that gamble, many did not. The social calculations were relentless and exhausting. Who to invite to your own gatherings, who to subtly exclude, who was currently rising in social standing, who was quietly falling, which hostess's invitation actually carried weight, which family had money without breeding, which had breeding without money, and what that particular combination meant for dinner seating arrangements. It was like playing 3-dimensional chess, while simultaneously memorizing everyone's middle name and their preference in desserts. The whole spectacle resembled a modern professional networking conference, except with significantly more lace, no name tags, and consequences that were dramatically higher. At a networking conference, the worst possible outcome is an awkward exchange near the elevator. At the season, the worst outcome is spending the next 4 decades married to someone whose company you find genuinely unbearable. The pressure was immense, the glamour was genuine, and somewhere beneath all those flickering candles and carefully composed compliments, thousands of young people were desperately trying to figure out whose hand they would still be holding in 40 years. Part 3, the coming out, one-shot, no-practice round. Before any actual courtship could begin, a young woman first had to be officially released into society, and this was itself a major event requiring significant preparation, expense, and the ability to walk backward in a 15-pound dress without catastrophic incident. Young women were presented at court, sometimes literally before the Queen, in ceremonies so elaborate and expensive that a modern wedding would look modest by comparison. Your first formal appearance as an eligible young woman was meant to announce to the entire world that you were, technically speaking, available on the marriage market. It was also designed to demonstrate that you could navigate a receiving line in a gown the size of a small tent without falling over. Many could not. The presentation itself was an engineering feat and an endurance test simultaneously. Debutantes wore enormous skirts, supported by frames that made ordinary doorways into geometric puzzles, court trains stretching 3 yards behind them, and a mandatory headdress featuring imported ostrich feathers that added another foot or 2 to their already precarious total height. Picture walking in a dress the size of a cathedral tent, with a peacock-themed hat secured to your skull, while clutching a small bouquet and suppressing every instinct to cry. Now do all of this directly in front of the actual Queen of England, who is watching you with the mild disinterest of someone who has witnessed several hundred terrified teenagers perform this exact ritual and is privately calculating how much longer until she can reasonably leave. The exit was the genuinely treacherous part. Under absolutely no circumstances were you permitted to turn your back on the monarch. This meant you had to back out of the royal presence while simultaneously dragging your enormous train behind you, navigating around other equally terrified debutantes, and maintaining the complete illusion of graceful composure throughout. Court trains had to be swept out behind you as you moved, which required a very specific flicking motion of the ankle that took months of dedicated practice to master. Young women rehearsed this maneuver for weeks at home. Trailing towels tied to their waists across bedroom floors, while their mothers watched, with the focused intensity of Olympic coaches analyzing competition footage. The financial investment was eye-watering. A presentation dress could cost the equivalent of a modest house. The ostrich plumes were imported at considerable expense. The shoes selected for the occasion would never be worn again. Families went into genuine debt for this single afternoon. It was considered a worthwhile investment, in roughly the same way parents today might invest in college tuition or professional headshots, except with substantially more ostriches involved. After surviving the court presentation, the newly launched debutante entered what amounted to a very public audition phase. Her name was now circulating in the right circles. She could attend proper balls. Gentlemen could be introduced to her. Her dance card could be filled. Her social existence had officially commenced, and everything she did from this moment forward was observed, catalogued, and discussed in drawing rooms across London. Ate with too much visible enthusiasm at dinner, noted and reported, laughed at a volume that exceeded acceptable limits, catalogued, danced twice with the same gentleman in one evening, very much noted, very likely reported to her mother before the second dance had even concluded. The emotional toll of this experience was rarely discussed openly. You were 17, possibly 18, often with no meaningful life experience beyond embroidery and some conversational French, and you were suddenly expected to perform social perfection before what was arguably the most evaluative audience in the Western world. Many women later described their first season with a mixture of nostalgia and residual anxiety, the way modern people might recall their wedding day or a particularly high-stakes job interview that somehow lasted 6 months. If your debut went badly, if you stumbled, if your plumes caught on a chandelier, if you accidentally laughed at an inappropriate moment, the damage could follow you through subsequent seasons. Gossip about a disastrous debut had staying power. Some families deliberately sent younger daughters through the process first as a kind of test run. Others pushed their eldest daughter forward and hoped for the best. Either way, there was no practice round available. You had one opportunity, and then you were in the game, whether you felt remotely ready or not. Part 4, the wardrobe, suffering beautifully as a romantic statement. Let's take a moment to discuss what everyone was actually wearing during all of this, because the clothing situation deserves its own dedicated attention. For women, imagine being laced into a corset tight enough to meaningfully rearrange your internal organs' preferred positions, then strapped into panniers, which were essentially wire cage structures worn at the hips, specifically designed to make you approximately 5 feet wide. Add 3 petticoats on top of that, a stomacher panel, stockings held in place by ribbon garters, and shoes that were engineered not for walking, but for decorative teetering. For men, the situation was not dramatically better. Silk breeches that squeaked audibly with movement, stockings that sagged at the knee, a waistcoat, a coat, a cravat tied in an arrangement so complex it required an hour's work to achieve, and buckled shoes. Everyone was profoundly uncomfortable. Everyone performed perfect comfort. This was considered romantic. The corset, called stays in the period, was the structural foundation of the entire female wardrobe. Stays were built from stiffened linen reinforced with strips of whalebone or occasionally actual wood, and they were laced up the back by a servant, because doing this yourself was physically impossible. The intended effect was the fashionable silhouette of the moment, which typically featured a flattened chest, a conical torso shape, and the kind of posture usually associated with furniture. Breathing deeply was technically possible, but inadvisable. Bending at the waist was essentially off the table. Picking something up off the floor required either a very accommodating companion or a personal willingness to simply surrender the dropped object and move on with your life. Panniers were the genuinely baroque element of the Georgian wardrobe. These cage-like structures worn beneath skirts could extend the hips outward to absolutely spectacular widths. At the height of court fashion, a full pannier dress could measure 5 or 6 feet across at the hip. This meant doorways had to be navigated sideways. Sitting down required advanced planning and careful execution. 2 women wearing full panniers could not comfortably occupy the same standard-sized room without inevitable structural conflict. Court ladies simply accepted that they were going to collide with furniture as a matter of course. It was like wearing a dining room table strapped to your waist and being expected to move through the world with delicacy. The makeup situation was its own particular horror story. The fashionable pale complexion was achieved with white lead paste, which was delightfully a slow-acting poison that progressively damaged the skin, which then required more white lead paste to cover the resulting damage, creating a cosmetic doom cycle of genuinely alarming efficiency. Rouge was applied to the cheeks in bright circular patches. Beauty marks, small pieces of dark fabric cut into decorative shapes, were adhered to the face to conceal blemishes or the pitting left by smallpox. Hair was powdered gray or white using flour or starch, which attracted rodents. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Women reportedly found mice in their hair with some regularity. Occasionally, the mice were still alive. Men's fashion had its own baroque suffering to offer. A gentleman's cravat, the elaborate neckcloth tied in increasingly complex knot configurations, could require well over an hour to arrange correctly, and ruining the attempt meant starting completely over with a fresh one. Some dedicated dandies reportedly went through a dozen or more cravats during a single morning's grooming, their valets gathering the rejected ones into quiet, long-suffering piles. Silk stockings showed every wrinkle, sagged at the knee with discouraging consistency, and had a marked tendency to develop runs at inconvenient moments. Breeches were cut so tight that sitting down required a cautious negotiation between the man and his trousers. And the shoes operated in a world entirely disconnected from the concept of pedestrian comfort. Both sexes wore heels, because apparently 2 inches of instability weren't quite enough. These shoes were designed for specific occasions, not for walking, and definitely not for navigating the streets of Georgian London, which were covered in mud, horse dung, and considerably worse things. Small wooden platform overshoes called pattens were sometimes worn to elevate the wearer above the street-level filth, which worked approximately as well as you would expect. All of this, every painfully constructed element, was considered visible proof that you were suitable marriage material. The discomfort was the point. Suffer beautifully or stay home. Part 5, the introduction. You are a ghost until someone vouches for you. You could not simply walk across a room towards someone you found attractive and begin talking to them. That would have been scandalous in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Instead, you needed a formal introduction conducted through a mutually approved social connection, and that connection needed to be of appropriate standing. Your blacksmith could not introduce you to a duke. The concept would have been absurd. The introduction was the fundamental gateway to existence in Georgian social life. Without one, you did not register as a real person to the other party, regardless of how much sustained eye contact you had been exchanging across the ballroom. You were, for all social purposes, a well-dressed ghost. The hierarchy governing who could introduce whom was labyrinthine in its complexity. A person of lower social standing could not presume to introduce someone positioned above them. A lady needed to consent in advance to being introduced to a particular gentleman, meaning her chaperone or the event's hostess would quietly consult her beforehand, asking whether she was willing to make the gentleman's acquaintance. If she declined, the introduction simply did not happen. The gentleman might be waiting across the room, composed and hopefully smiling, only to receive the quiet information that Miss So-and-so had developed an inconvenient headache. The headache was real. The headache was also strategic. The introduction itself followed a script rigid enough to have been legally enforceable. Names were exchanged in specific order according to rank. Titles were deployed correctly. Gentlemen bowed. Ladies curtsied. Certain compliments were categorized as acceptable. Others were categorized as presumptuous. Once an introduction had been completed, the two parties could theoretically speak to each other at future social events without the process being repeated, but only in properly public settings. Private conversation still required additional social permission, preferably involving a chaperone, a piano, or both. And here is where things become properly absurd. Even after a successful introduction, you still could not simply approach the person who interested you. You required a socially acceptable reason for the approach. Requesting a dance was acceptable. Commenting on the evening's weather was acceptable. Walking directly toward her and informing her that she had exceptionally captivating eyes was absolutely not acceptable, would be reported to her father by nightfall, and would likely terminate any future possibility of communication entirely. Think of it as the original sliding into someone's messages, except the message system is locked behind a permissions structure administered by your acquaintance's aunt. The system created an entire arena of intense nonverbal communication, because direct approach was forbidden and enormous interpretive weight fell on glances, small smiles, and strategic physical positioning. A young woman wishing to signal genuine interest in a particular gentleman might, entirely by coincidence of course, find herself standing near him at the refreshments table, or discover herself positioned in the natural path of his circuit around the ballroom. Plausible deniability was the governing principle. If anyone observed anything, you had simply not noticed he was there, while your coloring betrayed you completely. Servants played a quiet but enormous role in this entire system. A well-placed footman could ensure that a letter reached the correct drawing room at precisely the right moment. A lady's maid could pass a note to a gentleman's valet who could pass it to the gentleman. Entire flirtations were conducted entirely through household staff, with the central participants never quite publicly acknowledging that anything was occurring at all. The servants, naturally, knew everything. They always did. A gentleman who attempted to bypass the introduction system entirely, approaching a young woman without clearance, without sponsorship, was committing social suicide. He would be branded a pest at minimum, a predatory rake at worst. His name would begin circulating in exactly the wrong way. He would find himself quietly removed from guest lists. He might as well pack up his waistcoats and relocate to the continent. The gate was real. The gate was guarded. And the key holders were watching with the focused attention of people who had nothing more important to do. Part 6. The letters. 3 days to deliver a text message. Once an introduction had been successfully navigated and mutual interest established, the next step, assuming genuine interest existed on both sides, was the written letter. And oh, the letters. Georgian Courtship generated a truly extraordinary volume of correspondence, and a significant portion of it was spectacular in its purple excess. Men composed sonnets comparing their beloved's eyes to stars, to still pools, to gemstones, and frequently to all three simultaneously if they were feeling particularly ambitious that afternoon. Women wrote back in carefully calibrated tones because sounding too eager suggested cheapness, while sounding too distant risked watching him drift toward the next available heiress. Writing a letter in the 1700s was essentially composing a text message, except it took 3 days to arrive and had a reasonable probability of being read aloud by your father at the breakfast table. The physical process of writing a letter was already a production in itself. You needed quality paper, which was expensive. You needed quills that required sharpening before use. You needed ink that required mixing. You needed sealing wax, a personal seal, a candle to melt the wax, and the discipline not to drip hot wax across the letter's surface, because a wax-splattered letter suggested carelessness or emotional disorder, neither of which was flattering. Ink spatters were common. Corrections were difficult and visible. The entire enterprise required both skill and patience. Your penmanship mattered in ways that went beyond aesthetics. A woman's handwriting was considered a direct reflection of her character, her education, and her inner stability. A controlled, elegant script suggested refinement and discipline. A hurried, uneven hand suggested a disorganized mind. Young women were drilled in handwriting for years, copying pages of elegant script under supervision, hoping that their eventual romantic correspondence would produce a favorable impression. It was essentially obsessing over font choice in a job application, except you couldn't simply select a different option from a menu. You had to physically train your fingers for a decade. The content of letters walked an extraordinarily narrow tightrope. You could not be too forward. Because any letter could be, and frequently was seen by people other than its intended recipient. Letters were shared among family members, read aloud for collective entertainment, circulated among friends, and occasionally published decades later in published memoirs. Any letter you wrote had to assume an audience of interested strangers alongside its actual addressee. So you wrote in a kind of elegant code, carefully worded compliments, strategic literary references, perhaps a pressed flower tucked inside the folded paper, which was the Georgian equivalent of sending a winking expression through a screen. Men had considerably more freedom in this regard. A gentleman's love letter could afford to be elaborate, florid, even slightly beyond the strictly appropriate, because the social consequences for him were comparatively mild. For a woman to respond in kind was genuinely risky. Clever women developed the skill of mirroring just enough warmth to maintain the suitor's interest while preserving the plausible modesty that protected their reputation. It was an exhausting performance conducted entirely in ink, with no ability to revise once sent. The delivery mechanism added another layer of anxiety to the entire process. Letters traveled via servants, via trusted friends, occasionally through the actual mail service, which was both expensive and slow. There was always the real possibility that a letter might be intercepted, read by unintended eyes, lost entirely, or delivered to the wrong address. Entire romantic connections could collapse because a letter went astray and the recipient concluded they had been deliberately ignored. And yes, Georgian ghosting was absolutely a thing. It simply took several months to become fully apparent. The love letters that survived from this period reveal something genuinely touching beneath all the theatrical language. Real people in real emotional difficulty trying very hard to sound composed and collected. Young men confessing to lying awake at night. Young women hinting at genuine affection while maintaining the performance of mere politeness. Between the formal phrases and the dramatic declarations, you can occasionally catch a glimpse of actual, clumsy human feeling. A teenager somewhere in 1782 scratching out a word for the fourth time, trying to find the right way to say something that people have always struggled to express. Part 7. The Chaperone, the original anti-romance technology. Now let us formally introduce a character who has been hovering in the background of every interaction we've discussed so far. The chaperone. Usually an aunt, a mother, an older married sister, or some other woman in her middle years who had been assigned the thankless mission of ensuring that absolutely nothing entertaining happened. A chaperone's job was to sit in a corner of the room with her needlework, while two young people attempted to conduct an entire emotional relationship through carefully timed glances and strategic positioning. She was there to ensure no hands made contact, no knees accidentally touched, and that nobody suggested stepping outside for a walk without the appropriate number of accompanying adults. The chaperone was not paid for this service. Not officially, she was simply expected. Unmarried women of a certain age were understood to be socially obligated to accompany younger unmarried women to every possible public event. This was theoretically a protective arrangement for the younger woman's reputation. In practice, it also functioned as a form of employment for widows, spinsters, and financially disadvantaged female relatives, who received room, board, and the implied status of usefulness in exchange for eternally hovering near someone else's social life. Think of it as being an emotional bodyguard, except you were not authorized to actually defend anyone. Your entire role was to look pointedly disapproving at any development that exceeded acceptable parameters. The unwritten rules of proper chaperonage were exacting. A chaperone had to be present without being intrusive. She had to remain within visual and auditory range without actively eavesdropping. She had to permit conversation while preventing any development toward genuine intimacy. She had to notice everything while pretending to remember only whatever reflected well on everyone involved. Have you ever tried to have a meaningful conversation while your mother sits 3 feet away pretending to read? Now add 18th century room acoustics, the unsteady illumination of candlelight, and the awareness that your entire future might depend on your ability to convey genuine feeling without saying anything a nearby older woman might find objectionable. This was performance art conducted at whisper volume. Good chaperones were silently treasured. A lenient aunt who dozed off in her chair after dinner was worth considerable social capital. A rigid mother who sat bolt upright radiating disapproval could single-handedly ruin what had otherwise been a promising afternoon. Young people traded detailed intelligence about which relatives could be counted on to develop convenient selective attention at key moments, and which ones would report a hand squeeze to the entire household before supper had even concluded. Securing the wrong chaperone was exactly like getting the most intense substitute teacher in school history. Some were lenient, some were nightmares. There were naturally methods for evading chaperonage, and young people of every era have demonstrated impressive creativity in this area. Garden walks offered the possibility of briefly disappearing behind a strategically located hedge. Picnics created opportunities to drift toward the edge of the group. The complex patterns of Georgian dancing placed the couple temporarily out of the chaperone's direct line of sight. The room was full, the candles flickered, the music was loud, and for a few precious minutes two people could exchange words that no one else could hear. These moments were treasured intensely. People remembered them decades later. The psychological impact of constant surveillance should not be underestimated. Young women were accompanied, observed, and reported upon from approximately age 16 until their wedding day, which might be years away. They had almost no genuinely private moments with anyone outside their immediate family. Even their own bedrooms were often shared with sisters or attended by maids. The concept of being alone in a room with a man you found romantically interesting was not merely forbidden. It was genuinely unimaginable to many Georgian women because they had never experienced solitude with anyone at all. And yet, through every constraint, couples managed to fall in love. They accomplished it in fragments, in half-finished sentences, in notes slipped beneath teacups, in shared glances across crowded rooms full of observers. Georgian courtship was, in many respects, the art of communicating everything while technically saying almost nothing. The chaperone may have been the declared enemy of romance, but she was also, entirely by accident, the mother of emotional subtlety. Every great love letter of the era exists specifically because two people were never allowed to simply speak plainly. Part 8. The Fan, Flirtation as Wartime Espionage. Women during this period had developed a complete and functional secret language conducted entirely through their fans, because actually speaking to the man you were interested in was so frequently impossible that alternative communication systems became necessary. Holding the fan in front of your face meant one thing. Snapping it shut communicated something entirely different. Resting it against your cheek meant you loved him. Dropping it deliberately meant we can be friends, which was the Georgian period's polite way of saying please stop pursuing this and redirect your energies elsewhere. The entire system was wildly inconsistent, varied significantly by region, and produced regular and genuinely entertaining misunderstandings, because apparently flirtation required encoding at a level usually associated with diplomatic communications. The fan itself was already a remarkable object. A proper ladies' fan could be constructed from silk, lace, decorative paper, or hand-painted vellum stretched over sticks of ivory, mother of pearl, or fragrant sandalwood. Some were small and discreet. Others were enormous, spanning nearly the full length of an extended arm when opened. They were expensive, they were beautiful, and they were genuinely functional, providing essential cooling in ballrooms where the combined heat of hundreds of candles and hundreds of bodies and multiple layers of clothing created an atmosphere resembling a pleasant sauna. A fan was simultaneously a woman's personal climate system, her deflection shield, and her non-verbal communication device. The language of the fan was never formally codified in any official document. It drifted through etiquette manuals, society columns, and the oral tradition of older sisters instructing younger ones. Some meanings were broadly understood across social circles. Twirling the fan in the right hand indicated that you were aware of being watched. Twirling it in the left hand indicated that you wished you were not. Holding the fan near your heart apparently communicated deep and sincere devotion. Closing the fan slowly and deliberately signaled willingness to consider a marriage proposal. Fanning yourself at high speed meant you were engaged. Fanning at a moderate pace meant you were married. Fanning frantically suggested imminent unconsciousness, which was, given the conditions described above, often accurate. The crucial complication was that this vocabulary was not universal. A gesture that meant come closer in one city might mean please leave in another. Families passed their own private fan dialects down through generations. Two women from different counties might exchange completely incompatible signals at the same event, each believing they were communicating with perfect clarity, each puzzled by the other's seemingly strange response. It was the 18th century version of regional slang colliding at a national gathering. Imagine conducting serious romantic flirtation in semaphore when no one has agreed on the definitions. The fan also provided the essential function of plausible deniability. A woman could conceal her entire face behind it when she needed a moment to collect herself, laugh privately, or cry without visible evidence. She could peer over the top edge to make deliberate eye contact with someone across the room, then snap it shut and look away, leaving him to wonder whether anything significant had just occurred. Entire small emotional dramas played out from behind fans, completely unreadable to outside observers, but vibrating with meaning to the participants. Men had no equivalent system. There was no secret language of the pocket watch, no coded significance to snuff box handling. Gentlemen were simply expected to read the fan signals, interpret them correctly, and act accordingly. Failing to read a fan signal marked a man as hopelessly unobservant. Reading it too fluently marked him as suspiciously experienced with women. There was no winning state, only slightly less losing positions. And yet, despite all the confusion, despite the mismatched regional dialects and the lost signals and the signals sent to the wrong person, the fan did carry genuine emotional weight. A woman touching the fan to her lips meant something. A man watching her do it felt something. The whole system operated at the very edge of language, in the narrow space where words were forbidden but glances were not. And in that restricted territory, a piece of folded silk on ivory sticks became one of the most expressively loaded objects in British social history. Part 9. The Ball Romance in a Slowly Heating Oven. The ball was the central arena of Georgian courtship, and let me be direct. Balls were long, they were hot, and they were physically exhausting in ways that costume dramas consistently fail to represent honestly. The dances themselves were not the gentle, dreamy waltzing you've seen in films. They were complex, multi-part sequences requiring significant memorization, considerable physical stamina, and the ability to not visibly sweat through silk. A single dance typically lasted approximately half an hour. That is 30 minutes of maintaining eye contact with someone while executing a choreographed routine in a room lit by hundreds of candles, surrounded by several hundred other people, in a building where deodorant had not yet been conceptualized. Love bloomed under conditions that by modern standards would classify as a health hazard. The candles alone represented a meaningful problem. A grand ballroom might be illuminated by several hundred beeswax tapers, each generating its own contribution of heat, smoke, and occasionally molten wax falling onto whatever lay beneath it. By midnight, the air was dense with the combined smell of burning wax, competing perfumes, and damp wool. Windows were typically kept closed to prevent drafts from disrupting the musicians, which meant the room simply accumulated heat continuously as the evening progressed. People fainted, not for dramatic or poetic reasons. They fainted because they were being slowly overheated in their own clothing. Dances themselves were marvels of structured chaos. The minuet, the gavotte, the cotillion, and eventually the riotous social revolution of the waltz, each demanded specific footwork, precise formation patterns, and the ability to remember which partner you were supposed to be facing at any particular moment in the music. You learned these from a dancing master who visited your home and drilled you for weeks until your feet ached and you harbored genuine resentment toward him as a person. By the time you arrived at the actual ball, you had either mastered the sequences or you had developed a convincingly timed fictional ankle injury. Both were socially respectable solutions. The process of pairing off for dances was its own separate drama. A gentleman would approach a lady. bow with appropriate formality, and request the honor of her hand for the next dance. She could accept, or she could demur, typically claiming fatigue or previously promised engagement. Declining a specific man without adequate reason was a social insult. Accepting him meant simultaneously declining every other man who might ask for that same dance, which created small cascading social explosions throughout the evening as rival suitors absorbed the intelligence. Once you were actually dancing, the physical contact was revelatory. In a society where touching someone's arm during conversation was scandalous, a dance permitted you to place your hand in another person's hand through gloves, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, accompanied by a full orchestra. And this was, for many couples, the most intimate physical contact they had ever experienced with someone outside their immediate family. The touch of a palm through kid leather apparently produced effects. Many personal diaries of the period confirm this. Many of those same diaries then describe those effects in considerable detail across multiple pages. The waltz, when it finally arrived in England in the early 19th century, triggered a genuine moral crisis because it required the man to place his hand on the woman's actual waist, her physical waist. Clergymen delivered sermons condemning it. Newspapers predicted the collapse of moral standards. Mothers prohibited their daughters from participating. And naturally, everyone danced it anyway, because after a lifetime of being forbidden any meaningful physical contact, a waltz felt like being lit on fire in the most wonderful way imaginable. By the evening's end, your feet were protesting seriously, your clothes were thoroughly damp, your carefully constructed hairstyle had largely abandoned its original architecture, your cosmetics had migrated, and you had fallen at least slightly in love with someone. You would travel home in your carriage at 3 in the morning, remove your shoes with the kind of sound typically heard from people who have done serious agricultural labor, and then lie awake in bed replaying every moment of the evening with obsessive attention to detail. Tomorrow there would be another ball. You would do all of this again, and despite everything, you would be glad. Part 10. The Dance Card, Romance Scheduled in Pencil. Every young woman at a ball carried a small card, often tied to her wrist with a ribbon, on which gentlemen wrote their names to reserve specific dances in advance. A completely filled card meant you were the social success of the evening. An empty card meant the night was going to be very long indeed. The card itself was frequently a charming object, sometimes made of ivory, sometimes elegant decorated cardstock, sometimes assembled as a tiny booklet with its own miniature pencil attached by a silk ribbon. Some dance cards were carefully preserved afterward, tucked into diaries as tangible evidence of a triumphant evening. Others were disposed of quietly, evidence of evenings best set aside and not revisited. A blank card at the end of the night was not merely disappointing. It was a public document of your social failure, visible to anyone who had seen it, and it would be remembered. The strategy embedded in the dance card system was genuinely intricate. A young woman did not simply accept the first partners who approached. She planned. If a particularly interesting gentleman was known to arrive later in the evening, she might hold a dance slot open for him, explaining to less desirable applicants that she was resting or had promised that particular dance to someone else. This strategy carried significant risk. If the desired gentleman didn't arrive or arrived and asked someone else, she would be left holding an empty slot and a story that no longer held together. Men had their own calculations to manage. A gentleman interested in a specific woman had to reach her early enough in the evening that her card still had open slots, but not so early that he appeared desperate. He needed to secure a dance, but ideally one of the better ones, not the opening dance, which could be read as merely polite, and not one of the final dances when fatigue was setting in and the musicians were losing their enthusiasm. The dances in the middle of the evening were the emotional sweet spot, where a well-executed half-hour could genuinely communicate serious interest. It was like attempting to schedule both a first and a second date simultaneously using a tiny card and a miniature pencil. Dance cards also generated their own category of social disaster. A gentleman who wrote himself onto a lady's card and then simply failed to appear for the dance left her standing visibly embarrassed on the floor when the music started. This was considered one of the most serious social offenses a man could commit at a ball, and it was remembered with precision. A man who stood up a dance partner might find himself unable to secure any further cards that evening, and possibly for several subsequent events, as words circulated with the reliable speed of a well-aimed rumor. 2 dances with the same man in a single evening was a meaningful statement. 3 was essentially a public declaration. A woman who allowed the same gentleman to claim multiple spots on her card was communicating to everyone in the room that she favored him, and his intentions had better be serious, because her name was now publicly attached to his. Mothers watched the cards being filled out from across the room with the concentrated focus of traders watching a market ticker. Every name, every position, every open slot signaled something. The dance card was, in its odd and compact way, the earliest form of structured romantic scheduling, predating synchronized digital calendars by a few centuries, but performing essentially the same social function. A woman who went home with a completely full card went home triumphant, clutching a souvenir of her social victory. A woman who went home with an empty card went home quieter, tucking it into a drawer, and hoping next week's ball would be different. Part 11, The Country House Visit, a week-long audition with legal consequences. Once mutual interest had been established through the approved channels of introductions, letters, and strategically managed dance cards, the next logical progression was the country house visit, which was essentially a week-long supervised sleepover with the potential to determine the entire shape of your future life. A promising young man would receive an invitation to stay at a family's country estate for several days, during which he would be subjected to everything from formal dinners to garden walks to parlor games involving blindfolds and mild public humiliation. This was the period during which both families observed the potential match in something closer to their natural habitat, like exceptionally polite zoologists conducting fieldwork in silk. The invitation itself was a coded declaration of intent. Families did not extend week-long hospitality to random bachelors. Invitations went only to men the family considered at minimum plausible candidates. Accepting such an invitation was itself a significant signal. Showing up meant you were serious enough about the young woman to submit yourself to several consecutive days of evaluation by her entire extended family, including the grandmother with strong opinions about everything, the uncle with an enthusiastic relationship with the port decanter, and the small cousins who would report every word you said directly back to the adults before you had finished saying it. The surface presentation of these visits was one of comfortable leisure. Morning rides through the estate grounds, afternoon walks, evening dinners, perhaps some shooting, a picnic, some music after supper. This was the visible layer. Beneath it, an unrelenting evaluation was operating continuously. Could he sit a horse without embarrassing himself? Could he hold a pleasant conversation with the elderly aunt without inadvertently insulting her? Did he drink too heavily at dinner? Did he pay the daughter appropriate attention without crossing into territory that would require a conversation with her father? Was his personal valet well trained? Did he tip the household servants appropriately? Were his boots of decent quality? Was he kind to the dogs? Every single observable detail was being logged by someone somewhere in the household, and the combined intelligence was being assembled into a comprehensive assessment. The young man, for his part, was running his own parallel evaluation. Was this a functional household or one operating under considerable strain? Were the parents affectionate with each other or barely civil? Was the estate as financially sound as the family presented, or were the drawing room curtains positioned strategically to conceal water damage on the walls? Did the daughter speak to her mother with genuine warmth or with barely concealed resentment? What was her piano playing actually like when heard in person rather than described in correspondence? Dinner table performances and music room demonstrations could reveal uncomfortable truths that no amount of carefully crafted letter writing had disclosed. Have you ever been required to sit through someone's relative playing the harp for 40 uninterrupted minutes while smiling with sincere apparent enjoyment? Now consider, you might eventually be required to live with the harpist for several decades. The activities were carefully designed to create controlled opportunities for the couple to interact with marginally less oversight than a formal ball would permit. A garden walk might include the young couple, a cousin, and an aunt, all moving along a path that was wide enough for two people walking side by side, but not quite wide enough for three to walk comfortably together. Conversational groupings shifted in apparently organic ways that were actually the result of careful orchestration. Card games were arranged so the couple ended up at the same table. Picnics were planned on estates large enough that the party would naturally fragment into smaller clusters, one of which would, entirely by coincidence, include the central couple and whichever chaperone was most reliably lenient. None of this was coincidental. It was choreography with a social purpose. Parlor games deserve specific mention because they were genuinely strange and serve as an interesting window into Georgian creative problem-solving around the prohibition on physical contact. Blind Man's Bluff involved one blindfolded participant attempting to tag other players, which in a room full of adults created permitted physical contact that would under any other circumstances have been scandalous. Forfeit games required participants to perform designated tasks, sometimes including cheek kisses, framed as light-hearted entertainment. These games were one of the very few socially sanctioned mechanisms by which unmarried people could touch each other, and absolutely everyone understood this, and absolutely everyone pretended they didn't. It was plausible deniability operating in its purest possible form. The visit concluded with a careful ritual of formal thanks and small parting gifts, followed by letters exchanged in the days afterward. If the week had gone well, a subsequent invitation would follow, perhaps for the family to visit the young man's own estate, giving the bride's family an opportunity to inspect the property that might eventually become her home. If the visit had gone poorly, a polite silence descended over the connection, and everyone involved quietly understood that the match was not proceeding. Either way, by the time the carriage pulled away down the gravel drive, the relationship had either been meaningfully advanced or quietly buried. A week in a country house decided futures. Part 12, the tea ceremony, a job interview with Biscuits. The afternoon visit was another major venue for courtship activity, and it centered entirely around the ritual of tea. But tea in the Georgian period was emphatically not a casual matter. Tea was expensive, imported, heavily taxed, frequently smuggled, and served with a ceremony that functioned simultaneously as a display of family wealth, a test of the young woman's training, and a demonstration of her steadiness under the specific pressure of not spilling boiling liquid on a baronet. It was essentially a job interview conducted with biscuits and fine china. Tea itself was a genuine luxury. A pound of quality tea could cost more than a week's wages for a working family. Wealthy households stored it in locked decorative caddies, the key of which was held personally by the mistress of the house and guarded with the intensity of a medieval castellan responsible for crown property. Servants were categorically not trusted with the tea. The tea was counted. The tea was rationed. The tea was treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for objects of genuine religious significance, because in a world where it represented that level of financial investment, it effectively was. The preparation ritual was elaborate and precisely choreographed. Hot water arrived from the kitchen in silver pots. Tea leaves were measured carefully from the locked caddy into the teapot. The tea steeped for a specific, calibrated length of time. Cups, saucers, sugar bowls, cream jugs, slop basins, and small silver spoons were arranged on the tea table with geometric precision. Everything was imported, expensive, and irreplaceable. The young woman pouring was performing a ceremony that simultaneously demonstrated her family's financial position, her own years of training, and the steadiness of her hands under observation. A visible tremor communicated nerves. A spill was a social disaster. The conversation during tea was its own structured performance conducted under specific rules. Topics were chosen carefully and in advance. The weather, the health of mutual acquaintances, recent reading, local events of moderate significance. Politics was scrupulously avoided. Religion was scrupulously avoided. Anything genuinely personal was avoided, unless it could be approached from a very considerable indirect distance. The suitor was expected to demonstrate convincingly that he could sustain pleasant conversation with the mother, the aunt, the elderly visiting cousin, and the young woman herself, in succession, without appearing bored, inappropriately forward, or intellectually limited. Have you ever navigated a job interview where the panel includes your potential spouse's entire extended family, and every member has their own opinion about the correct way to hold a teacup? That was tea. The accompanying food presented its own test. A gentleman was not supposed to eat with visible enthusiasm that would suggest poor self-discipline, but he also couldn't refuse what was offered, because declining hospitality was a form of insult. The correct approach was to accept one biscuit, eat it with evident but restrained appreciation, and produce absolutely no crumbs on the upholstery. The upholstery was also expensive. Everything in the room was expensive. The room itself was essentially a display case communicating the family's resources, and every object in it was quietly saying that the daughter came with a specific standard of living attached. Young women were trained from childhood in the precise choreography of presiding over tea. Mothers drilled daughters in how to hold the pot, how to offer cream and sugar, how to pass a cup without rattling the saucer against it. It was the kind of skill that looks effortless only after years of practice, the domestic equivalent of figure skating, performed in a drawing room before an evaluative audience. After approximately 40 minutes to an hour, the suitor was expected to rise, offer his formal thanks, and depart. Staying beyond that window was presumptuous. Leaving before it was rude. The correct timing was approximately the duration required to drink 2 cups of tea and consume 1 small biscuit at the pace dictated by polite conversation, which worked out to somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour in practice. If he managed it correctly, another invitation would follow. If not, the next knock at the door would introduce an entirely new candidate, and the teapot would be warming for someone else. Part 13. The Matchmaking Mother, Intelligence Officer, Strategist, and Closer. No figure in the entire ecosystem of Georgian courtship was simultaneously more feared, more respected, and more quietly terrifying than the matchmaking mother. These women possessed encyclopedic and constantly updated knowledge of every eligible bachelor within a radius of approximately 100 miles. Their annual incomes, the condition of their estates, their rumored gambling debts, their family histories, and whether any of their uncles had died of something that would reflect poorly on the bloodline. A skilled matchmaking mother could engineer an entire romantic connection between 2 people who had barely exchanged words, using nothing more than a strategically arranged dinner party and extremely pointed seating decisions. The matchmaking mother was not merely a personality type. She was a functioning social institution. In a world where young people were prohibited from pursuing their own romantic interests with any meaningful freedom, someone had to do the pursuing on their behalf, and that someone was, overwhelmingly, the mother. She was the strategist, the intelligence officer, the negotiator, and the final closer, all consolidated into one formidably capable person. Her daughter was the product. The ballroom was the sales floor. The matchmaking mother was the manager, and she was not going home until she had moved the inventory. Her information network was genuinely impressive. She maintained correspondence with other mothers across the country, comparing intelligence on eligible gentlemen with the enthusiasm of thoroughbred enthusiasts comparing racing prospects. She knew whose son had just come into his inheritance. She knew whose nephew had embarrassed himself at university. She knew whose cousin had returned from India with an unexpectedly significant fortune. She knew who was in actual debt versus who was merely presenting a financially distressed appearance. She knew which estates were heavily mortgaged and which were properly secured. Nothing of significance got past her. Modern professional networking platforms have genuinely nothing on a Georgian mother with her correspondence open and her daughter's prospects on the line. Her tactics were subtle but operated with considerable precision. A dinner party would be arranged with the desired suitor seated adjacent to the daughter, at sufficient distance from rival candidates to prevent interference. A carriage excursion through the park would be timed so the family vehicle happened to pass the young gentleman's conveyance at precisely the optimal moment. Letters would be written. Invitations would be extended. Introductions would be quietly engineered through carefully selected intermediaries. The daughter often had no awareness of the extent of the orchestration happening behind the scenes. She simply noticed that a certain young man seemed to appear at events she attended with remarkable consistency, and that he was always smiling in her direction. The matchmaking mother could also neutralize a developing connection if she decided the candidate was unsuitable. A lukewarm reception at the door, a daughter who was inconveniently unavailable, a quiet multiplication of chaperones at every subsequent event, and the young man would quickly understand that he was no longer welcome. No explicit communication was required. The shutdown was expressed through hundreds of individually deniable small choices that were collectively and unmistakably conclusive. It was the original strategic blocking, conducted entirely through social calendar management. Novels of the period are populated with matchmaking mothers, and most depict them with a mixture of genuine affection and honest horror. The most famous example from English literature is Jane Austen's Mrs. Bennet, a woman whose entire purpose appears to be securing husbands for her 5 daughters by whatever means present themselves. Mrs. Bennet is frequently mocked for her lack of subtlety, but she is also looked at clearly, simply doing her job in the most direct way available to her. In a society where daughters could not inherit property, could not pursue professional careers, and could not remain unmarried without becoming financially dependent on relatives, a matchmaking mother stood between her children and a slow, graceless descent into genteel poverty. Her urgency was completely rational. Her methods were what the circumstances required. Not every matchmaking mother operated from purely mercenary motivations. Some genuinely wanted their daughters to find happiness and worked to balance financial practicality with real consideration of emotional compatibility. Others simply wanted grandchildren as quickly as possible. A few were so relentlessly overwhelming in their pursuit of results that their daughters ended up accepting the first adequate proposal that arrived, primarily as a means of escaping the household. Mothers were the architects of Georgian marriages, and the architecture, whether elegant or chaotic, was almost always theirs. Part 14. The marriage settlement romance arrives with a legal team. Before anyone actually married anyone, a substantial period of negotiation took place that had essentially nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with financial documentation. Lawyers representing both families would convene to work out the marriage settlement, a comprehensive legal agreement covering the dowry, the pin money, the jointure, and a considerable vocabulary of additional financial terms that were, in practical terms, a detailed prenuptial contract. The dowry was what the woman brought into the marriage. The jointure was the income she would receive if her husband died before her. Everything was itemized, calculated, and occasionally argued over for months. Romance was the decorative element. The settlement was the actual architecture. The dowry was the headline figure. It could take the form of cash, land holdings, shares in commercial ventures, or some combination of all three. A daughter from a wealthy family might arrive in a marriage with tens of thousands of pounds, a staggering figure in a world where a comfortable middle-class annual income might be a few £100s. A daughter from a more modest family might come with a few thousand or a small sum and some household furniture. The size of the dowry did not guarantee a satisfying marriage, but it profoundly shaped who would even seriously consider making an offer. Eligible bachelors, much like modern investors in particular asset classes, had minimum thresholds below which they did not engage. Pin money was the personal allowance a wife received from her husband for her own expenses, and it was a fiercely contested item in settlement negotiations. A well-crafted settlement locked in a pin money provision that a stingy husband could not later reduce or eliminate. Without this protection, a married woman might find herself in the position of having to request money from her own husband for every personal purchase, clothing, books, contributions to charitable causes. A woman with secured pin money had at least a small degree of genuine financial autonomy. A woman without it was, in a very practical sense, entirely dependent on her husband's generosity and mood on any given day. The jointure was the widow's safety net. If the husband died, The jointure guaranteed the surviving wife a specific annual income for the remainder of her life, regardless of what subsequently happened to the estate itself. This provision mattered enormously because estates typically passed intact to the eldest son, and without a jointure, a widow could find herself suddenly without either a home or an income, entirely dependent on the goodwill of her own adult child. A properly constructed jointure could protect a woman from years of uncomfortable dependence. A poorly constructed one could leave her moving between relatives' spare rooms with an air of quiet resentment that no one would openly acknowledge. The lawyers involved were serious professionals who worked carefully and took their time. Negotiations routinely extended across weeks or months. Clauses were added, debated, modified, and sometimes removed entirely. Provisions were included for potential future children. Agreements addressed what would happen to various assets under different circumstances. Imagine simultaneously signing the paperwork for a mortgage, a comprehensive life insurance policy, and a divorce settlement, while wearing silk and maintaining a composed social expression, and you begin to approximate the experience. The young couple, meanwhile, had negligible input into any of this. In most cases, the settlement was negotiated by their fathers, with the groom occasionally consulted on specific points and the bride almost never. She might not know the final agreed figures until the settlement document was read to her on her actual wedding day. Her entire financial future was being determined by men in a room she was not permitted to enter, using a specialized vocabulary she had likely never been educated in. Her technical consent to the marriage was required, but the detailed terms of what that marriage would look like financially were handled entirely elsewhere, without her participation. And yet, and this is the historically interesting complication, the system did provide certain protections that women in later centuries had to fight significant legal battles to reclaim. A carefully negotiated Georgian settlement could actually protect a woman's property from her husband's creditors, preserve her personal income during the marriage, and guarantee her financial independence after his death. It was not romantic, it was not equitable. But for a woman in an era without divorce access, without property rights, and without employment options, it was the only legal framework keeping her from potential financial ruin. Love was the bonus if it arrived at all. The settlement was the actual transaction. Everyone understood this, and everyone maintained the polite fiction that it wasn't. Part 15. The proposal, a nervous speech in a strategically ajar drawing room. When a man finally determined the moment had arrived to propose, it typically happened in a drawing room during a carefully arranged private moment, with the door left deliberately open by a precise few inches to preserve technical propriety while allowing the necessary conversation to occur. The proposal itself was frequently brief, visibly nervous, and heavily scripted in advance. Some men spent weeks rehearsing their intended speech. Some men, upon finally arriving in the moment, accidentally proposed to the wrong sister entirely. This is not an embellishment. It happened multiple times in the historical record. Usually the proposal was less a spontaneous declaration of overwhelming passion and more a formal confirmation that both families had already reached a working agreement approximately 3 weeks earlier. The mechanics of getting into the room required their own delicate navigation. A gentleman would formally request a private interview with the young lady, which itself communicated his intentions to absolutely everyone in the household. The mother would conspicuously arrange to be in an entirely different part of the house. Sisters would be removed from the vicinity, though they were in all probability conducting acoustic surveillance from behind the nearest convenient door. The father was typically already fully aware, having been approached earlier for his consent, which was not legally mandatory after a certain age, but was socially expected without exception. By the time the young couple found themselves nominally alone in the drawing room together, every other person in the building already knew what was about to happen and was actively pretending not to. The language of the proposal itself tended toward the formal and somewhat businesslike. Men did not typically drop to one knee. Despite what costume productions enthusiastically suggest, they stood. Sometimes they paced the available floor space. They drew a breath, and they delivered a prepared speech. These speeches typically covered the suitor's genuine regard for the young woman, his assessment of his own financial prospects, his intentions regarding establishing a household, and his hope that she would consent to becoming his wife. Some of these speeches were eloquent, many were not. A significant number of young men, overcome by the accumulated pressure of the moment, stumbled through their prepared material, lost their place, forgot crucial sections, and ended in a strained silence, while the young woman waited with an expression combining sympathy and barely contained alarm. The question of rings is worth clarifying directly, because the modern assumption about engagement rings does not transfer to Georgian practice. The mandatory diamond solitaire was not yet a convention. Some couples did exchange rings at engagement, often sentimental pieces featuring pearls or containing a lock of the suitor's hair. Diamonds appeared occasionally, but were not the dominant default by any means. The more standard engagement token was actually a portrait miniature, a small hand-painted likeness of the intended party set into a locket or a decorative case. These were commissioned from artists, painted over several weeks, and exchanged as tangible proof of serious intent. Think of giving someone a portrait of yourself, except the portrait required 6 weeks to produce and cost the equivalent of a month's income. The young woman's response was technically hers to give independently, but in practice, it had almost always been signaled in advance through family channels. She might still decline, but doing so at this final stage was socially disruptive and personally awkward for everyone involved. Acceptance was typically indicated subtly rather than announced dramatically. A quiet affirmation, a nod, a hand extended, a composed small smile. Tears, theatrical fainting, and declarations of eternal devotion were not the standard response. Georgian proposals were, by and large, dignified conversations that concluded in a firm, quiet agreement. Whatever genuine passion existed found its expression later. The wrong sister incident deserves its own specific acknowledgement because it occurred with a frequency that reveals something about the conditions of Georgian courtship. With chaperones in attendance, inadequate lighting, similar dresses worn by sisters of comparable ages, and strong family resemblance combined with extreme nervous tension, a gentleman occasionally delivered his declaration of undying devotion to a young woman who was definitively not his intended target. The subsequent moment, as the sisters exchanged a glance and the gentleman processed what had just occurred, represents one of the more purely awkward situations Georgian social life regularly produced. Some of these cases actually resulted in marriages to the accidentally proposed to sister, when it emerged that she had been interested all along. Life occasionally provides its own plot resolutions. Once accepted, the news was shared first with the immediate family, then with close relatives, and eventually with the broader social circle through written announcements and oral communication. The couple was now formally engaged, which carried genuine weight and legal obligation. Breaking an engagement at this stage required serious justification and carried potentially significant legal consequences. The proposal had been made. The answer had been given. The machinery of the wedding was already operating before the drawing room door had fully closed behind them. Part 16. The decision to refuse courage with a price tag. A woman could, technically, decline a proposal. The social consequences of doing so varied dramatically depending on her individual circumstances. If she was a wealthy heiress with multiple prospects and substantial family backing, she could say no gracefully and wait for the next candidate. If she was the fifth daughter of a country clergyman with limited dowry and no particular advantages, declining a reasonable offer might mean spending the remainder of her life as the slightly mysterious aunt who lives upstairs and develops very involved embroidery projects. The pressure to accept could be immense and was rarely subtle. The mathematics of refusal were genuinely cold. A young woman considering a proposal had to weigh the specific man in front of her against every other man who might theoretically propose at some future point and calculate with uncomfortable honesty whether another offer was realistically likely to materialize. If she was beautiful, financially well-positioned, and socially well-connected, she could afford to exercise real selectivity. If she was plain, or from a family with too many unmarried daughters competing for limited prospects, she might be facing effectively a single realistic offer in her lifetime. Declining it meant, in practical terms, declining marriage itself, which in this era meant declining a home, an income, and a recognized social role simultaneously. That was a substantial collection of things to decline because someone's laugh was slightly irritating. Family pressure was enormous and frequently explicit. Parents who had watched a daughter enter her middle 20s without attracting serious candidates were not predisposed to support her declining a man with adequate income and functional health. Mothers wept. Fathers delivered extended lectures. Aunts materialized unexpectedly to offer perspective that happened to align precisely with the family position. The collective disappointment of an extended family could become an almost physical presence at the dinner table, a weight that attended every meal. The suitor himself sometimes responded to rejection with damaged pride, injured letters, or in more extreme cases, public suggestions that the young woman had encouraged his attentions inappropriately. These suggestions could damage her reputation considerably, particularly if witnesses existed who could confirm that she had appeared receptive during earlier interactions. Declining after a prolonged courtship exposed a woman to accusations of deliberate manipulation. The legal concept of breach of promise had real practical consequences and was occasionally deployed in exactly these circumstances. Still, some women refused. Some declined even materially advantageous offers. The reasons were varied and sometimes entirely legitimate. Certain suitors were known by reputation to be cruel, intemperate drinkers, or compulsive gamblers. Some women held genuine affection for less suitable men and were willing to wait. Some simply could not face spending decades in the daily company of the person currently standing in front of them and concluded that unmarried independence, for all its documented disadvantages, was honestly preferable to waking beside someone they actively disliked. Those refusals required genuine courage. The phrasing of a refusal was itself an art form requiring careful execution. A direct and unadorned no was considered harsh and could permanently humiliate the man. The socially preferred approach was to express sincere regret, to emphasize her own inadequacy rather than his, to explain that she could not offer him the quality of affection he genuinely deserved, to wish him every happiness in his future, and to express hope for continued friendly acquaintance. Every word was selected to cushion his pride, while leaving absolutely no ambiguity about the final answer. Have you ever had to decline someone through carefully worded language that sounds like a sympathy note? Georgian society had formalized that skill into a precise art. The aftermath was predictably uncomfortable. The refused suitor typically withdrew from the social circuit temporarily, nursed his dignity, and eventually identified another candidate. The refusing woman's family closed ranks around her with polite firmness, insisting the decision had been mutually difficult and that the parties were simply not suited to each other. The woman herself frequently spent subsequent weeks writing detailed justifications in her diary and reassuring herself that her decision had been correct. Sometimes it demonstrably was. Sometimes it turned out to be expensive. Either way, she had exercised one of the very few genuine choices Georgian society made available to her, and she would live with whatever followed for the rest of her life. Part 17, The Age Gap, an Asymmetry Nobody Questioned. Georgian courtships frequently involved age differences that by present-day standards would produce immediate and significant concern. It was entirely unremarkable for a man in his 40s to court a woman in her late teens, particularly if he brought financial resources she could not otherwise access. These arrangements were routinely described as practical and suitable. In reality, a significant number of young women walked down the aisle to a man who remembered their father's school days as recent events. The arithmetic of these arrangements was stark and straightforward. A man in his 40s in the 18th century was frequently a widower, his first wife having died in childbirth or from illness, both of which were common. He had an established income, possibly children from the previous marriage, and a practical need for someone to manage his household and potentially provide an additional heir. A young woman in her late teens or early 20s met all the stated requirements. She was healthy, adaptable, and young enough for the reproductive role being implicitly described. The match was not typically characterized as involving an age gap. It was characterized as suitable. The young woman's feelings about discovering that her prospective husband was 25 years her senior, losing his hair, somewhat set in his preferences, and had clear memories of events that occurred before her birth, these feelings were not the primary consideration. If her family approved the arrangement, and if his income was sufficient to provide security she could not otherwise reasonably expect, her preferences operated as a secondary concern. She might be gently told that affection would develop naturally over time, that his steadiness of character would make him a considerate husband, that his financial position would provide comfort and stability. These consolations were offered in the same general tone used to recommend medicine. The social dynamics within such marriages could be genuinely peculiar. A young wife in her 20s might find herself managing a household that included adult stepchildren who were closer to her own age than her husband was. Stepchildren often harbored resentment toward a new wife, particularly one young enough to be a sibling, especially if they had existing attachments to the previous wife's memory. Household staff who had served under the previous mistress would need to adjust to receiving direction from someone they might have watched grow up. Dinner tables in these households could become quiet theaters of carefully maintained surface civility. Conversation was another casualty of the gap. A man who had spent his formative years during one cultural moment and a woman who had spent hers during an entirely different one had genuinely limited common reference points. Humor didn't always translate across decades. The young wife who raised a recently published novel might receive a patient smile and a reference to something printed before her birth. The older husband, who referred to political events from his youth, was describing experiences his wife had missed entirely through the accident of being an infant at the time. They lived in the same house, but in a quiet way in different periods. And yet some of these marriages genuinely functioned. A man who had developed patience with age, who had moved past the impulsiveness that characterizes younger men, could sometimes provide a more consistently considerate domestic partnership than a contemporary husband might have managed. A young wife spared a same-age husband's immaturity, occasionally found real companionship with someone who took her seriously. The gap was not always experienced as damage. It was simply a condition, and some couples found workable arrangements within it. The reverse configuration, an older woman marrying a younger man, was rare and carried heavy social stigma. A widow in her 40s who formed a connection with a man in his 20s was considered faintly absurd at best, accused of foolishness or moral weakness at worst, and provided material for newspaper satire and printed commentary. The male prerogative to marry young was not considered transferable to women. Her age was her deficit. His age was simply his character. The double standard was not new in the Georgian period. The Georgians simply made it structurally explicit and architecturally embedded in the social system. Part 18. Cousin Marriages, the Family Tree as a Topiary. Marrying your cousin was not only legally acceptable in Georgian England, it was often actively encouraged. Keeping wealth, property, and titles consolidated within family lines was considered eminently practical. First cousin marriages were legal, relatively common, and frequently celebrated as elegant solutions to otherwise complicated inheritance arrangements. Genetic diversity was not yet a concept with scientific grounding, and the family tree in certain aristocratic households resembled a decorative topiary with branches that looped back upon themselves in unexpected configurations. The logic was ruthlessly straightforward. If your eldest son needed to marry advantageously, and your brother's daughter came with a substantial dowry that happened to include land directly adjacent to your own, the solution presented itself with the clean satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. Two estates could be consolidated. Family fortunes could be doubled rather than divided among distant relatives. Titles that might otherwise require splitting could remain in the direct line. From the perspective of a landowner managing an estate built up over 3 generations, a cousin marriage was not an awkward family arrangement. It was responsible, long-term planning. Children in families operating with these ambitions often grew up already knowing the general outline of their expected future. Cousins of compatible ages were brought together frequently at family gatherings and encouraged to develop familiarity as children, then as young adults. A girl might spend her summers at her uncle's estate from the age of 7 onward, gradually building a comfortable bond with her male cousin through years of shared experience. By the time both reached marriageable age, the transition from childhood companion to prospective spouse appeared, to everyone else involved, entirely natural and practically inevitable. It was the original arranged marriage, conducted over the course of several summers and celebrated at family birthday gatherings along the way. The emotional experience of these matches varied considerably. Some cousin couples had genuinely known each other their entire lives and found in that familiarity a real foundation for a functional partnership. They shared references, childhood memories, a comfortable knowledge of each other's family eccentricities. That kind of existing connection could translate meaningfully into a working marriage. Other cousin couples had grown up in essentially sibling-like proximity and approached the prospect of matrimony with confusion and considerable reluctance that no wedding breakfast could entirely resolve. Reorienting your understanding of someone you remember as a sticky-handed 8-year-old into a romantic partner required some substantial mental adjustment. The medical consequences were becoming visible to attentive observers, even without the scientific framework to explain the mechanism. Families that repeatedly married within close blood relationships sometimes produced children with recurring health difficulties, fragile constitutions, and conditions that appeared across generations with suspicious regularity. Physicians of the period occasionally noted the fragility of certain aristocratic lines, though they generally attributed this to fashionable dietary habits, environmental factors, or moral failings rather than to the family tree. The actual explanation, recessive genetic variants encountering each other at higher rates in closely related individuals, was centuries away from being understood, but the observable effects were available to anyone willing to look at the pattern. The fiction of the period treated cousin marriages as entirely normal possibilities, because they were. Jane Austen's novels include multiple cousin relationships treated as completely ordinary social options, some approved by the narrative and some not. The practice persisted well into the 19th century before beginning to lose social favor, partly through growing awareness of hereditary illness patterns and partly through shifting cultural attitudes about intimacy within family relationships. In its Georgian height, however, marrying a cousin was not a secret or an embarrassment. It was frequently the arrangement laid down informally at your christening and formalized at your wedding 2 decades later, with the complete approval and genuine enthusiasm of everyone present. Part 19. Gretna Green, Romance versus the English Legal System. For those who could not obtain parental approval through conventional channels, there was always Gretna Green, a small village positioned just across the Scottish border that became famous for allowing couples to marry without the waiting periods, the formal reading of bans in church, and the parental consent requirements that English law mandated. Elopements to Gretna Green became a genuine Georgian institution, complete with a flourishing trade in blacksmiths who performed quick but legally binding marriage ceremonies. Running off to Gretna Green was romantic, rebellious, genuinely scandalous, and occasionally ended with an angry father catching up in his own carriage and physically retrieving his daughter before the ceremony could be completed. The legal mechanism was straightforward. English marriage law, formally established in 1753, required the reading of bans in a Church of England parish for 3 consecutive weeks before a wedding, or the obtaining of a special license to bypass this requirement, and for anyone under 21, documented parental consent was mandatory. Scottish marriage law had no comparable requirements. A couple needed only to declare their intention to marry in the presence of witnesses, and the marriage was immediately and fully legally binding. Gretna Green happened to sit at the first significant settlement on the Scottish side of the primary road north from England, which transformed it almost overnight into a destination wedding location of considerable notoriety. The The blacksmiths of Gretna Green became legendary participants in this industry. Any adult could legally officiate a Scottish marriage, and the local smiths, being visible community figures, reliably available, and conveniently positioned near the main crossroads, found themselves in the role. The blacksmith's anvil became the symbolic altar, and the hammer blow became a metaphor for the forging of a legal union. Some couples found the whole arrangement charmingly unconventional. Others, staring at a tradesman in a leather work apron while trying to get married, found themselves wondering whether this was genuinely how they had imagined the day would unfold. The journey itself was an ordeal under pressure. From London, a couple had to travel by hired postchaise at considerable expense, changing horses at regular intervals, racing north with maximum urgency. The trip consumed several days of nearly continuous travel, during which the couple had to stop at roadside inns for meals and sleep, while constantly monitoring the road behind them for pursuit. Angry fathers who discovered the elopement quickly enough could hire their own fast carriages and give chase, and the resulting race was sometimes quite literal. Several famous elopements ended with the runaway couple's carriage arriving at the village mere minutes before the pursuing father. Some ended with the father winning the race entirely. A woman who eloped, even successfully, and into a marriage she genuinely wanted, carried the social consequences of her impulsiveness for years. Polite society forgave many things, but rarely forgot a bride who had publicly humiliated her parents. Invitations might quietly cease to arrive. Acquaintances might develop convenient social distance. Even a perfectly happy marriage following a Gretna Green ceremony could be shadowed by sustained low-level social disapproval. For some couples, this was a price they assessed as worth paying. For others, it turned out to be steeper than anticipated. The phenomenon generated its own popular culture industry. Plays featured desperate lovers racing north while determined fathers pursued them in the next carriage. Newspapers covered notable elopements with the enthusiastic detail of modern entertainment journalism. Gretna Green became cultural shorthand for reckless romantic determination, and the word itself evoked passion, attempting to outrun calculation. Not every elopement was a love story, however. Fortune hunters, men specifically targeting young women with significant inheritances, sometimes persuaded naive heiresses to elope as a method of securing the marriage before the family could legally intervene. Once married, the husband gained legal control of her fortune, and no court would undo a valid marriage. Gretna Green, for all its romantic associations, was also the setting for some genuinely calculating acts of financial acquisition dressed in the language of love, with everyone involved performing the fiction that this had been the outcome they had wanted all along. Part 20. Reputation, the single most fragile asset in existence. A woman's reputation was the most valuable thing she possessed in Georgian society, more valuable than her dowry, her appearance, or her musical accomplishments. A single rumor, a single observed moment that could be interpreted as improper, could destroy her marriage prospects entirely and permanently. Being seen alone with a man, even briefly and entirely innocently, could be sufficient. Letters intercepted, gossip passed at a tea gathering, a whispered suggestion at a ball, a strategically timed observation shared in confidence. These were the weapons of social destruction, and they were deployed with practiced enthusiasm and remarkable efficiency. The fragility was by design. A reputation built over years of careful behavior could collapse in the course of a single afternoon. A young woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong could find her prospects in ruins because someone had observed her emerging from a garden path at dusk alongside a gentleman who was not her brother and had drawn the most damaging available conclusion. The conclusions did not need to be accurate. They needed only to be repeated. Have you ever had a group conversation decide something about your life that was entirely false and then refuse to release the narrative no matter what evidence was presented? Now imagine the group conversation is the entire county and the subject is whether you are marriageable. The rules governing acceptable behavior were exacting and largely unwritten, which made them considerably harder to navigate than documented regulations would have been. Being alone in a room with a man was problematic. Being alone in a carriage with a man was worse. Riding through a field with a man with no other riders within visible distance was a full social crisis in the making. Dancing more than twice with the same man in a single evening implied impropriety. Writing letters to a man you were not formally engaged to was considered forward. Accepting jewelry as a gift from a man who was not a family member was deeply suspicious. The vocabulary of potential scandal was enormous, and every woman was expected to know all of it intuitively from approximately age 16 onward. The consequences of damaged reputation were immediate and durable. Invitations stopped arriving. Acquaintances became mysteriously unavailable. Men who had been actively pursuing withdrew without explanation. Younger sisters found their own prospects affected by association. The family, rather than defending the accused daughter, often closed ranks against her, sending her to a remote relative in the countryside until the gossip cycle ran its course, if it ever did. In serious cases, a young woman might be permanently relocated to live with a distant aunt. Her social life effectively concluded before her 25th birthday. Men faced no equivalent risk. A gentleman involved in a scandal might experience a brief reputational inconvenience, but could generally recover fully by traveling to the continent for a year and returning with a slight tan and renewed eligibility. The identical incident that ended a young woman's social life might actually enhance a young man's standing among his peers. This imbalance was so thoroughly embedded in the social structure that it barely registered as unfair to most participants. It was simply the conditions, the weather of Georgian social life. Everyone accepted it. Gossip was the operating mechanism of the reputation economy, and it ran continuously. Letters between female relatives across the country transmitted news of social incidents faster than any newspaper of the period could manage. Servants talked among themselves, and the intelligence traveled upward through the household. Visiting cousins carried stories across counties. By the time a young woman realized her reputation was under threat, the damage had frequently already propagated to locations she had never visited. Attempts to correct an established false narrative almost invariably failed, because corrections never traveled as far or as fast as the original accusation, and people found the interesting version more compelling than the accurate one. The defenses available were meager. A woman could protest. Her mother could write carefully worded letters to selected allies. Her father could formally demand an apology from whoever had originated the rumor, though this approach generally amplified the story by drawing additional attention to it. The single most reliably effective defense was marriage, any marriage, arranged with reasonable speed, because a married woman enjoyed considerably more protection from gossip than an unmarried one. A significant number of hastily arranged Georgian weddings had reputation management as their primary purpose, with love appearing as an optional additional feature. The reputation economy was merciless, arbitrary, and absolute in its consequences. Every young woman living within it learned to navigate its dynamics carefully or experienced what happened when she didn't. Part 21. The Rake Charm as a Weapon. Every courtship ecosystem needs a villain, and the Georgian period produced them in impressive quantities. The Rake, as this particular character type was universally known, was a man of considerable charm, adequate wealth, and deeply questionable intentions. He attended the same balls, performed the same dances, composed the same flattering letters, but his objective was rarely matrimony in any genuine sense. Novels of the period were dense with dire warnings about rakes, and every debutante was drilled, frequently by her mother, sometimes by older sisters, occasionally by bitter personal experience, on how to identify one, how to avoid one, and what to do if she had already, against all advice, fallen for one. The archetype was remarkably consistent across several decades. A rake was typically well-born, adequately funded, and educated to a point. He had spent time at university without producing a degree, traveled the European continent on what was politely termed the Grand Tour, and returned with strong opinions, fashionable clothing, and an impressive personal familiarity with gambling establishments, expensive entertainments, and the particular varieties of scandal available in Paris. He was often handsome in the way that costly things are handsome, visibly maintained, carefully presented. He was also, beneath the surface, frequently in serious financial difficulty because his chosen lifestyle had consumed whatever inheritance he had originally been allocated, and he now required a wealthy wife to restore the situation. His tactics were documented extensively, in part because novelists kept producing essentially instructional exposés about them. A rake would identify a young woman with a significant dowry, typically one who appeared slightly less supervised than the average, slightly more susceptible to concentrated attention. He would then deploy focused, individualized interest that made her feel like the most fascinating and uniquely understood person in any room. He would dance with her twice in an evening, send carefully selected small gifts, and quote poetry in a voice pitched low enough that no surrounding chaperone could comfortably overhear. He would remember details she had mentioned casually and reference them in subsequent conversations, creating the impression of deep and attentive regard. Have you ever experienced someone deploying overwhelming romantic attention in the first week of an acquaintance, making grand gestures and declarations before any real foundation exists? Georgian rakes essentially developed and systematized the technique, absent the digital infrastructure. The objective varied by individual. Some rakes genuinely intended to marry their target purely for the financial resolution this would provide, and planned to resume their preferred lifestyle immediately following the wedding, leaving the new wife to manage a country estate independently while he returned to London's entertainments. Others had no serious intention of marrying at all, hoping only to compromise the young woman's reputation sufficiently to either extract financial settlement from her embarrassed family or persuade her to leave with him as a companion outside the bounds of marriage. The most strategically sophisticated combined approaches and adjusted their methods based on which seemed most likely to produce results in a particular situation. Mothers were the primary defensive line. A vigilant mother investigated every serious suitor with genuine thoroughness, writing to contacts in London to inquire about his gambling record, his drinking patterns, his previous entanglements, and his general reputation among people who actually knew him beyond social surfaces. A suitor who charmed a drawing room brilliantly, but whose references came back ambiguous, would be quietly frozen out, with the daughter sometimes never told the specific reason why. The mother would simply engineer the end of the connection through the usual social machinery, and the daughter might spend years wondering what had happened to the delightful Mr. Whoever, never knowing her mother had intervened to save her considerable future misery. Novels played an enormous role in distributing practical awareness about this character type. Samuel Richardson's extraordinarily long novel Clarissa, published in the 1740s, featured one of the most thoroughly analyzed fictional rakes in English literary history, a charming and calculating predator who methodically destroys a virtuous young woman's life across thousands of pages of detailed narrative. Every young woman with access to books was encouraged to read such works, not primarily for entertainment value, but for the practical education they provided. The consistent message was identical across different authors and decades. A man who seemed too attentive, too articulate, too enthusiastic, too early in an acquaintance was almost certainly operating with motives that did not include her genuine well-being. Running in the opposite direction was consistently recommended as the correct response. Nevertheless, considerable numbers of young women fell for rakes regardless, because the warnings sometimes made the rakes more compelling rather than less. The quality of being explicitly forbidden had its own gravitational pull. Some of these involvements ended in ruined reputations and quiet retreats to distant relatives in the countryside. Others ended, remarkably, in actual reform, with the rake eventually settling into something resembling a respectable domestic existence. Novels of the period almost never permitted this resolution. Real life, being messier than fiction and less committed to consistent moral messaging, occasionally allowed it. Even Georgian villains sometimes grew up. Part 22. The poetry, terrible, sincere, and largely plagiarized. A remarkable proportion of Georgian courtship involved the exchange of poetry, and honesty requires acknowledging that the vast majority of it was genuinely dreadful. Men who could barely maintain consistent spelling attempted to compose sonnets comparing their beloved's complexion to moonlight, her voice to nightingales, her hair to substances that hair does not actually resemble under any observable circumstances. Women received these compositions with varying combinations of genuine delight, quiet horror, and private mockery shared with sisters later in the evening. Some of the poetry was sincere. The majority was copied, often directly from published collections of pre-written courtship verse that existed specifically for this purpose. Plagiarism was widespread and largely tolerated as an acceptable practice. The market for ready-made love poetry was substantial. Entire volumes were published containing verses organized by romantic occasion, physical characteristic of the beloved, and even the first letter of her name. A gentleman could browse through a collection and locate a poem suitable for a woman whose name began with E, whose hair was auburn, whose eyes were blue, and with whom he had danced 3 weeks previously at a country ball. He would copy out the selected verse in his own handwriting, perhaps substitute 1 or 2 words to suggest personal composition, sign it as if it had emerged directly from his own emotional depths, and send it off. The young woman receiving this poem might very well own the identical volume and recognize the source immediately. Some women chose not to mention this. Others preserved the matching published verse alongside the received letter specifically to share with their sisters later. The resulting laughter was apparently considerable. The thematic content of Georgian love poetry was spectacularly predictable. Her eyes were invariably stars, occasionally moons, very occasionally suns when the poet felt ambitious. Her cheeks were consistently roses, sometimes lilies if the writer was reaching for variety. Her voice was always a nightingale, her figure always a willow, her hair always gold regardless of its actual observable color. The poet's heart was unfailingly pierced, wounded, burning, melting, or experiencing some creative combination of these physical catastrophes simultaneously. The poet himself was typically described as dying slowly and agonizingly of his own affections, which, given that most of these young men were visibly vigorous enough to ride horses and attend shooting parties throughout the alleged dying process, represented a clear overstatement. The rhyme schemes could be genuinely painful to encounter. The vocabulary of 18th century English offered a limited pool of words with convenient rhyming partners, and the same pairings appeared with exhausting regularity across different poets and different decades. Heart rhymed with dart, with part, with smart. Love rhymed with dove, with above, occasionally with glove when desperation set in. Sigh rhymed with I, with die. A young woman reading through a received love poem could typically predict the word that would end the next line before she had reached it. The game became one of confirming what you already expected rather than discovering anything new. Have you ever received a message from someone that appeared to have been assembled primarily through automatic word suggestion? Same fundamental experience, approximately 3 centuries earlier. Women sometimes composed poetry in return, though they were held to considerably different standards than men in this activity. A lady's verse needed to demonstrate sufficient refinement to signal a cultivated mind, but not so much genuine literary achievement as to seem threatening or unfeminine. Writing too well was a social liability in its own right. A young woman who composed poetry of genuine quality risked being labeled a bluestocking, a derogatory term for a woman of intellectual inclination, which in Georgian social terms was a disadvantage roughly equivalent to possessing some other prominent unconventional quality. The ideal female response was a poem that was technically competent, mildly and appropriately flattering to its recipient, and not quite accomplished enough to make him feel intellectually outcompeted. Calibrated mediocrity was an actual skill with practical social applications. The best courtship poetry of the period was produced by people who had genuine literary ability, and it has survived in anthologies where it is still read and appreciated. The overwhelming majority, however, was produced by young men with sincere emotional investments and no measurable technical talent, and has thankfully been lost to the passage of time. A small but charming quantity survived in family papers, preserved in diaries or bound into personal commonplace books, and has occasionally been published in subsequent centuries as historical curiosities, where it serves mainly to confirm that inadequate writing is a thoroughly timeless human activity. The exchange of poetry, however, served a real social function independent of the literary quality of any individual poem. It was a mechanism for declaring serious interest, for committing intentions to paper, for creating a documented record of affection that both parties could return to later. The words mattered less than the deliberate act of composing and sending them. A clumsy poem genuinely composed and sincerely sent was, in its own peculiar way, a real offering, even if the recipient had to work quite hard to maintain a straight face while reading it. Part 23. The Gossip Network: Intelligence Without Infrastructure. Information was the fundamental currency of Georgian social life, and gossip was the exchange mechanism through which it circulated. Every social event, every observed interaction, every reported conversation was catalogued, analyzed, and transmitted across a vast informal network of aunts, cousins, letter-writing friends, and household servants. The servants, in particular, knew everything worth knowing. A lady's maid knew which letters her mistress was reading with particular attention. A footman knew which gentleman had called, for how long, and what expression he was wearing when he left. Gossip traveled from the kitchen to the parlor to the neighboring county with remarkable efficiency, and by the time it completed its journey, it had typically become a considerably more compelling story than the original events had warranted. The servant intelligence network was formidable as an information-gathering apparatus. Ladies' maids dressed their mistresses every morning and evening and were present for a great many unguarded remarks. Footmen carried letters between households and knew precisely who was corresponding with whom at what frequency. Valets observed the condition of their employers' clothes upon return from outings and could deduce a considerable amount about where the evening had actually been spent. Cooks overheard conversations at breakfast when the household was not yet fully on guard. Grooms noticed which carriages stopped at which houses and for what duration. None of these workers were necessarily engaging in deliberate or malicious information gathering. They were simply talking to each other in their own quarters about the events of their working days, and the aggregated intelligence flowed upward through the household system in the form of subtly communicated hints that eventually materialized in drawing rooms as apparently common knowledge. A young woman who believed she had carefully concealed her correspondence with a particular gentleman might discover, with considerable surprise, that her mother was already entirely aware of the situation, because her mother's personal maid had a sister employed in the kitchen of the young woman's household. And the sister had observed the sealed letters sitting on the hall table awaiting collection on multiple occasions. Nothing escaped this network with any reliability. Even the most carefully maintained secret tended to develop leaks, because the household in which it was being kept was staffed by approximately a dozen professional observers with nothing more pressing to occupy their attention. Female correspondents carried gossip further still. Women of the period wrote letters to each other with extraordinary frequency, sometimes daily, and these letters functioned as the period's equivalent of a dedicated social news feed. A notable scandal occurring in Bath could be described in comprehensive detail in a letter reaching a cousin in Yorkshire within a matter of days. The cousin would then share the substance of the story with her own social circle. Within 2 weeks, the original incident might have traveled across the country, gaining embellishments at each retelling until the actual events had become almost unrecognizable, but the version in circulation was no less widely accepted as accurate. The content of this gossip was varied in scale and mostly mundane in nature. Who had been observed walking with whom in Hyde Park on Tuesday afternoon, whose daughter had been visibly upset at a recent ball and under what circumstances, which family's financial situation was rumored to be less stable than presented, whose son had lost an inadvisable amount at cards the previous week, whose neighbor had developed an enthusiastic relationship with the wine cellar. The overwhelming majority of this material would be instantly forgettable by modern standards. But in a society without telephone communication, with newspapers of limited geographic reach, and without other forms of mass information distribution, Gossip was the primary mechanism by which people maintained their working knowledge of their social world. Targeted gossip could also be deliberately weaponized. A mother who had decided a particular suitor was unsuitable could circulate strategic doubts about his character through carefully selected channels, letting a few trusted friends know, in absolute confidence of course, that she had heard certain things about his previous conduct that gave her pause. These friends would then repeat the information, once again in absolute confidence, until the relevant social circle had fully absorbed the message without anyone being quite certain where it originated. The targeted young man might find himself mysteriously excluded from invitations and social events, with no one willing to provide a direct explanation. Reputations were systematically dismantled through this mechanism on a regular basis, quietly and with considerable efficiency. Yet the gossip network also performed genuinely protective functions. A predatory character whose behavior became known could be identified and warned about through exactly the same channels. A financially precarious situation could be flagged before a daughter committed herself to a ruinous connection. The network was a dual-purpose instrument, capable of destroying innocent reputations and of protecting young women from disasters they would otherwise have walked into without warning. It was flawed, frequently unfair, and regularly malicious in its applications. But it was also, in a society lacking any formal information infrastructure, the only intelligence service available to families making consequential decisions. Everyone feared it, everyone participated in it, no one seriously questioned whether it should exist. Part 24. The sensory reality, love blooms in challenging conditions. Let's pause here for a moment of genuine honesty about the physical reality of Georgian courtship, specifically the sensory reality, which the candlelit romanticism of the period's portrait paintings consistently fails to communicate. Regular bathing was not common practice. Deodorant had not been conceptualized, let alone manufactured. Dental care was rudimentary at best and frequently non-existent. Many people had visibly missing teeth, persistent bad breath, and skin conditions that no amount of carefully applied lace could adequately conceal. People covered themselves in perfumes, scented powders, and heavily fragranced waters, which layered over everything else and created, in a crowded ballroom at midnight, an atmospheric combination that would, by modern standards, cause significant distress to the human nose. Romance flourished regardless, because no one in the room had a reference point for anything different. Full bathing was infrequent and logistically complicated. A complete bath required large quantities of water, each of which had to be heated over a fire and physically carried to a bathing tub, a process requiring hours and the participation of multiple servants. Most people bathed fully only occasionally, preferring instead to wash specific areas of the body using a basin of water and a cloth as needed. Linen undergarments were changed more frequently, which was considered the primary method of maintaining cleanliness. The theory was that linen absorbed the body's oils and odors, and replacing the linen was functionally equivalent to washing. It was not, as any modern person would confirm after approximately 30 seconds of proximity, actually equivalent to washing, but it was the operating assumption. Teeth were a widespread and visible problem across all social classes. Sugar had become cheap and heavily consumed during the 18th century, and its cumulative effects on dental health were catastrophic and pervasive. Many people in their 20s had already lost multiple teeth. Those who had retained most of their teeth often displayed obvious decay, and the physical pain of untreated dental problems was a persistent reality of daily life. Toothbrushes existed but were not universally adopted. Some people cleaned their teeth with cloth, or with preparations of crushed charcoal mixed with herbs, or with nothing at all. Breath at close conversation range was an experience that varied considerably and frequently in unfortunate directions. Perfume was applied with genuine aggression by both men and women. Scented waters, oils, and powders were deployed partly as signals of wealth and refinement, and partly, let us be direct, as aromatic covering for whatever else was happening beneath them. The perfumes themselves were often heavy and complex, layering floral notes over animal musks over exotic spices. In a well-ventilated space, certain combinations could be genuinely pleasant. In a crowded, sealed, overheated ballroom occupied by several hundred perfumed and physically active people in multiple layers of heavy clothing, the combined effect was something that contemporary accounts describe in terms of headaches, dizziness, and the need for immediate fresh air. Some guests fainted at these events. The officially stated reason was invariably the stuffiness of the room, which was the polite way of attributing the problem to everything except the specific things causing it. Skin conditions went largely untreated and were extremely visible. Acne, eczema, various rashes, and the persistent scarring left by smallpox, which was both endemic and disfiguring, was simply part of the expected visual landscape of human faces. The white lead cosmetics used to achieve fashionable pale skin actively damaged the skin they were meant to improve, creating a deterioration cycle in which women applied more cosmetic product to cover the damage caused by the previous application of the same product. Beauty patches, those small decorative fabric shapes adhered to the face, covered the worst of the visible damage. Fans handled the remainder. A woman of fashion might invest hours at her dressing table preparing to appear in public, and the finished result, however carefully constructed, was concealing substantial underlying damage. Lice were a quiet but essentially universal feature of daily existence. The elaborately powdered wigs so iconic of the Georgian aesthetic were prime habitat for various parasitic insects, and the powder itself attracted additional unwanted guests. Women's elaborate hairstyles, built up on wire frames, fixed in position with pomades and pins, and maintained intact for days or weeks at a time, became small enclosed ecosystems. Discreet scratching was common. There were even specific decorative tools designed for polite public scratching that could be used without obvious acknowledgement of what you were doing. Everyone was intermittently itchy. Everyone maintained the social fiction that they were not. Despite all of this, and this is the genuinely important point, people fell in love. They felt desire and longing, and the specific, particular ache of genuine romantic attachment with the same intensity that humans have always experienced these things. The crucial factor is that their frame of reference was entirely their own era. They had never encountered the experience of a climate-controlled room where everyone smelled primarily of soap. They had never met someone whose presence was olfactorily neutral. What would strike a modern visitor as immediately and overwhelming challenging was simply the unremarkable background texture of daily life. No more consciously noticed than traffic noise is by someone who has lived in a city their entire lives. Love adapted, romance adapted, desire adapted, and the ballrooms filled every Wednesday night regardless. Part 25. The engagement legal limbo with emotional weight. Once a proposal had been accepted and the news formally announced, the couple entered a peculiar transitional state that combined elements of courtship and marriage without the full permissions or obligations of either. They were not yet married, but they were no longer independently free. A broken engagement was a serious matter with potential legal consequences, particularly the breach of promise lawsuit, which allowed a jilted woman to sue for financial damages. Men contemplating withdrawal from an engagement had to weigh not only social consequences, but the genuine possibility of being summoned to court and required to pay substantial sums. Love, the Georgians discovered, came with invoices. Breach of promise suits were functional legal instruments with real teeth. A woman who had been formally promised marriage with letters, witnesses, or documented family negotiations as evidence could pursue legal action against a man who withdrew from the engagement without adequate justification. The underlying legal reasoning was that a broken engagement damaged the woman's reputation, reduced her remaining marital prospects, and caused concrete harm to her future, since she had removed herself from the active marriage market during the engagement period and was now returning to it in a somewhat diminished position. Juries, frequently sympathetic to this reasoning, awarded meaningful financial damages. Some men were left in genuinely difficult financial circumstances by these judgments. The social dynamics of the engagement period were their own particular form of awkward. The couple was expected to behave as an effectively married unit in some respects, appearing together at social events, receiving joint invitations, being treated by their circle as a confirmed pair. Simultaneously, they were not permitted the physical or emotional intimacy that actual marriage would allow. Chaperones remained in attendance, though sometimes with marginally more relaxed oversight than during active courtship. Letters could be somewhat warmer in tone, but not dramatically so. The engaged couple occupied a transitional space that came with the social obligations of marriage minus its actual freedoms. Practical preparations consumed much of the engagement period. Wedding arrangements required attention, though Georgian weddings were generally far more modest than modern equivalents. The trousseau, the collection of linens, clothing, and household items the bride would bring to her new home, needed to be assembled, a process that typically extended over several months of sewing and careful acquisition. A proper trousseau could include dozens of nightgowns, chemises, petticoats, and household linens, most of them embroidered by hand with the bride's new initials. This was a substantial production, and the bride's female relatives often gathered specifically to assist with the needlework component over extended sessions. The groom's financial situation came under renewed scrutiny during this period. Even after the settlement had been formally signed, if new information surfaced regarding debts, gambling losses, or other financial difficulties, the bride's family retained the practical ability to reconsider. An engagement was easier to exit than a marriage, and more than one engagement concluded when a quiet investigation by the bride's uncle revealed that the fiancé owed several £1,000s to creditors he had not previously disclosed. The engagement would be dissolved, breach of promise considerations notwithstanding, because the alternative of marrying into active financial ruin was demonstrably worse than enduring the legal and social fallout of calling things off. The emotional weight of the engagement period was substantial and varied widely between couples. Some found that the slightly increased freedom to interact allowed genuine closeness to develop, their conversations deepening as they began contemplating specific details of a shared future. Others discovered, with varying degrees of alarm, that the person they were committed to marrying was not quite the individual they had believed themselves to be courting in the controlled environment of formal courtship. With marginally more freedom to interact came marginally more honesty, and occasionally the honesty was inconvenient. She was less charming than he had supposed. He was more rigid than she had anticipated. Cold feet were not an invention of modern engagement culture. They were a Georgian epidemic, managed quietly behind practiced smiles and polite public confirmations of mutual enthusiasm. Long engagements, lasting a year or more, were common when the groom was completing his education, waiting to formally inherit property, or awaiting a military commission. Extended waiting periods tested both parties' commitment and occasionally revealed that the commitment had not been as durable as it had appeared. Short engagements carried the opposite problem: insufficient time to discover the incompatibilities that would later surface as significant issues. Either way, once the announcement had been made, both parties were committed to seeing the arrangement through, or paying the social, financial, and personal costs of escaping it. Part 26. The wedding, surprisingly quiet, deeply practical. You might reasonably expect Georgian weddings to be grand, elaborate theatrical productions. They were generally not. A typical wedding took place in the morning at the local parish church with only close family present, the bride wearing her best available dress, which was not necessarily white, with the entire ceremony concluding in under an hour. A wedding breakfast followed, which was neither breakfast in the morning sense nor particularly elaborate by any modern standard. The whole affair was, by present-day expectations, almost shockingly understated. It was, in practical terms, the necessary legal paperwork of marriage conducted in an appropriate public setting with a small invited audience. The legal framework was specific and non-negotiable. Under the Marriage Act formally established in 1753, English weddings were required to be performed in a Church of England parish church between the hours of 8 in the morning and noon, with either the public reading of banns in the parish for 3 consecutive weeks or the obtaining of a special license to bypass this requirement, and with at least 2 witnesses present throughout. These requirements were deliberately strict, designed specifically to prevent the clandestine private marriages that had created legal chaos in earlier decades. A couple could not declare themselves married in a private drawing room. The ceremony had to be conducted publicly, legally, and in the correct designated location. This is precisely why morning weddings became the default format, and why afternoon and evening ceremonies, now entirely standard, were practically impossible under the applicable law. The bride's dress was whatever she genuinely considered her finest gown, often in a color she would continue to wear for other occasions afterward. The association of white wedding dresses with weddings as a universal tradition did not become established until the Victorian era, a fashion directly popularized by Queen Victoria's own wedding in 1840. Georgian brides wore blue, green, yellow, pink, rich red, or whatever color suited their complexion and wardrobe. The dress might be newly commissioned for the occasion, or it might be a reworked and updated version of an existing gown. Even newly commissioned wedding dresses were expected to be worn again on subsequent occasions. The concept of a single-use wedding dress preserved in storage as a relic was a later cultural development. The guest list was typically small, close family members, a handful of intimate friends, the legally required witnesses. The grand society wedding with hundreds of guests filling an elaborate venue was a later invention. Most Georgian weddings had total attendance measured in the low dozens at most. The ceremony itself was the standard Church of England service, conducted in ordinary contemporary language without theatrical embellishment. The couple exchanged their vows, the minister pronounced them married, the register was signed, and the wedding was complete. The entire ceremony could be conducted in 30 to 45 minutes with nothing left out. The wedding breakfast, the reception equivalent of the era, was held immediately following the ceremony at the bride's family home, attended by the same small group who had been present at the church. The name was sometimes literal, when an early morning ceremony was followed by an actual breakfast service featuring cold meats, pastries, fruits, and wine. The wedding cake was a feature, typically a dense fruitcake heavy with dried fruit, glazed and decorated, but not yet the towering architectural showpiece of later centuries. The gathering concluded after a few hours, and the guests dispersed. Many elements of recognizable modern wedding practice connect directly to Georgian precedent. The giving of the bride by her father, the exchange of rings, the spoken vows, the signing of the register, these all trace directly to standard Georgian practice. What has changed is the scale and the performed theatricality. A Georgian wedding was a family event conducted with practical restraint rather than a large public celebration. The contemporary expectation that a wedding should represent the most elaborate party of the couple's combined life was a later cultural development driven by Victorian sentimentality, Victorian industrial prosperity, and eventually the formidable marketing infrastructure of the 20th century. After the breakfast concluded, the couple departed. The guests returned to their own lives. The bride's family went back into a house that was now noticeably emptier. Within a day, the bride had gone from her parents' home permanently, having transferred legally, socially, and physically into an entirely different life. The wedding was quiet. The transition it represented was not. Part 27. The Wedding Night, Vulnerability Without Preparation. The wedding night was, for most couples, a deeply awkward encounter between two people who barely knew each other and had in all likelihood never been permitted to be alone in a room together until that precise moment. Sexual education for young women consisted, at best, of a vague conversation with a mother or aunt on the morning of the wedding, typically featuring some gentle variation of the advice to relax and think of something pleasant. Many young brides arrived at their wedding night in genuine uncertainty about what was specifically expected to occur. Many young grooms were not dramatically better informed. The information available to young women on this subject was essentially absent. Any direct discussion of anatomy, reproduction, or physical intimacy was categorized as indecent, and mothers who made any attempt to prepare their daughters typically did so in such carefully indirect and euphemistic language that the actual substance was unclear. A bride might understand in some abstract sense that something was expected to happen on her wedding night, but the specifics frequently came as a genuine surprise. Some personal diaries from the period record young women arriving at this experience in states of sincere bewilderment, not from sheltered innocence exactly, but from a complete absence of concrete factual information about the subject. Consider being handed the keys to a vehicle you have never been told exists, in a country whose roads you've never seen, and being expected to navigate confidently. The metaphor is imperfect, but the information gap it describes is approximately accurate. Young men were only marginally better positioned. Some had gathered information from older friends, from servants, or from experiences during travel on the continent. A portion had visited establishments catering to this during their university years, an unspoken but relatively common practice among young men of means, not generally discussed in polite company. A meaningful number had no prior experience whatsoever and were as genuinely nervous as their brides. The cultural assumption that all young men arrived at marriage experienced, while all young women arrived entirely innocent, was a convenient fiction. The actual range of experience on both sides was wide, unpredictable, and almost never discussed openly, including between the spouses themselves, even on the relevant night. The physical setting contributed its own layer of difficulty. The wedding bed was in the groom's house, in a room the bride had typically never previously entered. Her belongings had been delivered earlier and unpacked by her lady's maid. She would be undressed with her maid's assistance, changed into a nightgown that was almost certainly part of her carefully assembled trousseau, and left alone to wait. The groom, meanwhile, would be somewhere in the house, perhaps with a final drink in the company of family or close friends, gathering whatever composure he could manage before proceeding upstairs. The entire household was aware of exactly what was occurring and maintaining a collective pretense of ignorance. Servants stationed near the relevant corridor could hear whatever there was to hear. There was no real privacy even in what was nominally the most private moment of the couple's shared life. The morning following was its own social ritual. The bride was expected to appear at breakfast looking composed and functional, and the household would observe her carefully for any signals about how the night had proceeded. In certain traditions, more direct physical evidence was examined, though this was less universal in English aristocratic practice than in some continental equivalents. Regardless, the household understood essentially what had or had not occurred, and the social pressure to have performed appropriately was significant. A bride who appeared visibly distressed or a groom who seemed obviously mortified generated commentary that could circulate for extended periods. The long-term consequences of a disastrous wedding night were difficult to escape in a society that offered no practical mechanism for dissolving a marriage. Couples who found themselves fundamentally incompatible on the first night together had to develop some workable arrangement for the decades ahead. Some managed to build genuine intimacy gradually over time. Others settled into separate bedrooms and separate social lives, maintaining a functional public partnership while conducting private existences that rarely intersected. This arrangement was more common than Victorian-era moral literature subsequently acknowledged, and it worked tolerably well as long as both parties reached an unspoken agreement about its terms. The honest emotional reality of the Georgian wedding night, stripped of myth and romanticization, was that it placed two people in profound vulnerability with essentially no preparation for what they were undertaking. Some couples emerged from the experience genuinely connected and with a foundation for real intimacy. Others emerged permanently estranged from each other. Most fell somewhere between these poles, navigating the first weeks of marriage with a combination of goodwill, confusion, and the gradual, slightly startled discovery that the person they had married was a stranger they would now spend decades slowly coming to know. Part 28. The Bridal Tour, a honeymoon with 8 companions. After the wedding, wealthier couples typically embarked on what was called the bridal tour, the direct ancestor of the modern honeymoon, except considerably less romantic in execution and considerably more logistical in character. The couple would travel, often accompanied by family members or close friends, to visit relatives, observe notable landscapes and properties, and generally begin the process of knowing each other in the comparative privacy of a hired carriage working its way across roads that were frequently terrible. The companions were the detail most startling to modern sensibility. A typical bridal tour was emphatically not a private journey for two people. The bride might bring a younger sister or a female cousin as a companion, this being considered entirely appropriate given that she had just left her family home permanently and might reasonably appreciate familiar female company during the transition. The groom might bring his own friend or younger brother. Add the bride's lady's maid, the groom's valet, various coachmen and associated staff, and the newly married couple found themselves traveling in a mobile domestic arrangement of approximately 8 people. Privacy was whatever quiet corner of a roadside in the couple could negotiate, which was, in practice, rarely very private. The itinerary tended toward the educational and the social rather than the purely romantic. Couples visited designed landscape gardens, notable country houses belonging to other families, historic ruins, and scenic natural locations. The Lake District had become fashionable for its dramatic landscapes. The Peak District offered atmospheric geology. Bath, Brighton, and various spa towns provided more urbane entertainments. The point was to see places, to observe how other established families had improved and managed their properties, picking up ideas that might later be applied to their own estate, and to accumulate cultural experiences that could be referenced in subsequent social conversations. A bridal tour was simultaneously partial relaxation, partial cultural education, and partial networking activity. Visiting relatives was a major component of the itinerary. The newly married couple was expected to call on the groom's extended family, the bride's extended family, and any family friends of particular social significance. Each visit might extend over several days, during which the couple would be accommodated in the guest rooms, displayed at formal dinners, and introduced to everyone in the relevant neighborhood. This was the social equivalent of circulating a formal announcement of the marriage to every branch of the extended family network, and it gave various relatives their first opportunity to form an opinion of the new spouse in person. For the couple, it meant almost no genuine time alone, an uninterrupted sequence of formal dinners requiring sustained social performance, and the obligation to be unfailingly charming to strangers every evening for weeks. The travel itself was physically punishing. Carriage journeys were slow, deeply uncomfortable, and frequently interrupted. Roads were poorly maintained and could be reduced by rain to near impassable mud. Inns along major routes varied from reasonably comfortable to genuinely appalling shared sleeping arrangements, unreliable food, and insect life in the mattresses were all common experiences. A bridal tour extending across 6 weeks might include only a handful of genuinely pleasant nights among a long series of jolting carriages and unfamiliar and mediocre sleeping quarters. The idea that this experience was romantic required a significant and sustained act of collaborative imagination. Some couples genuinely carved out meaningful connection during their tour regardless. Long carriage journeys, despite their discomfort, created hours of enforced proximity and conversation during which two people who barely knew each other could begin to actually know each other. A quiet walk through a ruined abbey, even with a cousin maintaining a respectful but present distance, could allow exchanges that felt like small victories of genuine intimacy against the prevailing social constraints. Some bridal tour solidified real affection. Others simply tested whatever existed without particularly strengthening it. The tour typically concluded at the husband's principal residence, where the bride now began the actual substance of her adult life. Her new home might be a London townhouse, a country estate of varying size and condition, or a more modest establishment depending on his income. The staff would be assembled to receive her formally. She would cross the threshold, often for the first time, and become the mistress of an establishment she had not selected, surrounded by servants she had not hired, in a life that was now entirely hers to manage and define. The tour had been the transition, the house was the destination. Part 29. The surprising presence of love. Here is the thing that all the contractual machinery, negotiated settlements, arranged introductions, and financial calculations tend to obscure. Georgian couples did sometimes fall genuinely, deeply, and durably in love. Real affection grew in the spaces between formal interactions, in carefully composed letters, in shared glances across crowded rooms, in half-finished sentences during chaperoned conversations, in private jokes whispered at tedious dinners. Love was not the organizing principle of Georgian courtship, but it was not absent from it either. The surviving letters between Georgian spouses tell a story substantially warmer than the cold legal architecture of settlements might suggest. Couples separated by travel, military service, business, or family obligations wrote to each other with tenderness that feels entirely recognizable across the centuries. A husband away on extended business might write to his wife daily, describing small details of his experiences and asking for equivalent reports of hers. A wife managing the household through a difficult period might confide her worries, her exhaustion, and her genuine longing for his return. These letters are not social performances. They are the actual texture of real attachment maintained across distances. Friendship within marriage was more common than the period's formal public performances would suggest. In a society where women were officially subordinate and men officially authoritative, many actual marriages operated in practice as genuine partnerships, spouses consulting each other on significant decisions, sharing anxieties and satisfactions, developing the private shared language of in-jokes and references that builds between people who spend substantial time together over many years. A husband who genuinely respected his wife's judgment might consult her on matters that official convention placed outside her designated sphere. A wife who relied on her husband's support might lean on him in ways that departed from the era's ideals of female self-sufficiency. The real marriages operating inside the formal marriages were often richer and more reciprocal than the prescribed version permitted. Intellectual companionship was a genuine possibility within certain marriages, and it produced some of the most interesting documented relationships of the period. Women read extensively when given access to books, and a husband who took his wife's mind seriously found an engaged conversational partner available whenever he wanted one. Letters between husbands and wives sometimes engaged substantively with politics, literature, emerging science, and philosophical questions, with both parties contributing meaningfully to the conversation. The convention that women were less capable of intellectual engagement with serious subjects was widely stated and frequently demonstrated to be wrong by the actual evidence of what Georgian women thought and wrote when they had the opportunity. Grief at a spouse's death provides perhaps the most honest evidence of the depth of feeling within these marriages. Widowers and widows wrote of their losses in terms that were not formulaic or socially performed. Diaries record extended periods of functional difficulty, inability to engage with ordinary life, and a persistent consciousness of absence that continued for years. If Georgian marriages were primarily or exclusively business arrangements conducted without genuine feeling, as the cynical reading of the settlement system might suggest, the grief responses would not be this intense. The grief was authentic. The attachment it reflected had been authentic. The commercial framework within which Georgian marriages were built did not preclude genuine human relationships from developing inside them. It simply provided an unusual and often uncomfortable starting point from which two people had to find their way toward each other. Some marriages were genuinely miserable, a period that systematically prioritized practical compatibility over emotional compatibility produced its share of couples who spent decades in mutual dislike or active resentment. Separate bedrooms, separate social circles, and elaborate daily choreography designed primarily to minimize contact were familiar solutions in households where the match had not generated any natural warmth. The Georgian era did not create the unhappy marriage. It simply offered fewer mechanisms for exiting one. Yet the counterweight to these was the surprising number of genuinely loving ones, couples who had not expected to love each other, who had married for reasons that had everything to do with property and nothing to do with feeling, and who had discovered over years of shared daily life that they genuinely preferred each other's company to any other available alternative. The romance in Georgian life was not the dramatic, operatic variety celebrated in popular fiction. It was quieter, slower, and often arrived well after the wedding itself rather than before it. But it arrived, and when it did, it tended to be durable because it had been built on daily life rather than on the performance of courtship. Part 30, The Long Echo, What the Georgians Left Behind. The rituals of Georgian courtship may appear bizarre from the distance of 2.5 centuries, but their echoes are embedded in contemporary romantic practice in ways that are easy to overlook precisely because they have become so familiar. The diamond engagement ring, the father formally presenting the bride at the ceremony, the white wedding dress, the bridal shower, the engagement announcement, the first dance at the reception. These all carry roots directly into the customs and the anxieties of the 18th century. Even the contemporary phenomenon of romantic seasons, the observation that people intensify their romantic efforts during certain months, is a direct cultural descendant of the London season. The formal engagement period is perhaps the clearest direct inheritance. The concept that a couple should maintain a defined interval between deciding to marry and actually marrying, during which they announce their intentions to family and friends, exchange rings, and organize the wedding, comes directly from the Georgian model. The specific details have softened considerably, but the underlying structure is intact. A modern couple posting their engagement announcement to social media is doing essentially what a Georgian couple did when their mothers sat down to write formal letters to every relative in the country with the relevant information. The wedding ceremony itself preserves the Georgian template to a remarkable degree. The bride walks down an aisle to meet the groom at the altar. They exchange vows witnessed by those present. A minister pronounces them married. Rings are given. A reception follows. Specific elements have accumulated and changed over time, but the fundamental event is recognizable from 2 centuries back. The honeymoon grew directly from the bridal tour, though the experience has been transformed almost beyond recognition in most respects. The underlying concept that newlyweds should travel somewhere together, away from their families, to begin their shared life in a transitional setting, is a refinement and privatization of what the Georgians did with hired carriages and 8 traveling companions. The social function of the experience, a deliberate transition between the wedding and the resumption of ordinary domestic life, has persisted even as every practical detail changed. Courtship itself, as a structured process with recognizable stages and social expectations, owes something to the Georgian framework. Contemporary dating advice continues to operate on roughly similar underlying principles. Early encounters are cautious, interest is communicated gradually, commitment is eventually made publicly, and a wedding represents the culmination of the process. The timelines have accelerated dramatically. The chaperones are gone. The dowry negotiations have been replaced by more informal conversations about finances, but the basic movement from strangers to committed partners still traces a path the Georgians would recognize in its essential structure. Swiping through profiles on a phone is not so different in fundamental function from scanning a ballroom for promising candidates. The filters are different. The sorting mechanism is different. The goal is recognizably the same. What has genuinely and profoundly transformed is the reality of choice. Georgian women could technically refuse a proposal, but their actual options were narrow and the pressures to accept were substantial and often overwhelming. Modern women can accept, decline, postpone indefinitely, renegotiate terms, or opt entirely out of marriage and still live complete and socially respected lives. This single shift, the genuine expansion of real individual choice, has changed the meaning of every surrounding ritual. A modern engagement that looks superficially like a Georgian one is actually a fundamentally different event, because both parties entered it freely, in a way that was rarely genuinely available to Georgian women. And yet, for all the genuine progress, some of the underlying anxieties have proven remarkably durable. People still navigate the social calculation of marrying well. Families still have opinions about their children's choices, and those opinions still carry weight. Financial considerations still quietly shape who partners with whom and under what circumstances. Reputation still matters, even when it is now managed through social platforms rather than drawing rooms and letter-writing networks. The machinery has been dramatically modernized. The human concerns operating beneath the machinery have been remarkably stable across the centuries. What we inherited from the Georgians was not merely the external rituals. We inherited the underlying preoccupations, the worries, the calculations, and the persistent, slightly irrational hope that somehow, despite all the practical arithmetic involved in forming a life with another person, something genuine might still find a way through. The candles gutter low. And so, as the candles gutter low and the ballroom slowly empties for the night, we leave behind the powdered wigs, the aching corsets, and the endlessly choreographed performance of Georgian courtship. What a spectacle it was. A world where love arrived wrapped in legal documentation, where a single glance across a crowded room could either launch a marriage or destroy a reputation, where aunts with iron spines guarded drawing rooms with the dedication of professional security personnel, and where a single carelessly phrased sentence in a letter could reverberate across counties for years. Consider it properly for a moment. Consider being 17 years old, laced into whalebone until breathing required deliberate effort, pushed into a presentation dress that outweighed you by a meaningful margin, and told plainly that the next few months would determine the entire shape of your existence. Consider writing letters you desperately hoped would remain private, while knowing that half the household would inevitably read them before the week was out. Consider dancing for 30 consecutive minutes in a room lit by 500 candles, with no deodorant anywhere in the building, while your mother observed from a chair against the wall and catalogued every exchanged glance with the focused attention of a research scientist. Consider being handed at the altar to a man you had met perhaps a dozen times across chaperoned formal events, and being expected to build an entire life with him before the week was properly out. And yet through all of it, through the absurdity and the fundamental unfairness and the genuine practical hardship of it all, people found each other. They laughed at tedious formal dinners. They scrawled terrible poetry in the margins of their personal diaries late at night. They fell in love slowly, awkwardly, sometimes without quite intending to, and they built lives together that endured through illness and distance and loss and the quiet, steady accumulation of years. The system was genuinely ridiculous. The humans operating inside it were not. So tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed, completely free to send a message to whoever you want at 2 in the morning, free to decline a proposal without triggering legal action, free to marry for love or for companionship or for reasons that are entirely your own. Perhaps spare a small thought for the young women who once waited in silent drawing rooms for a suitor to arrive and make his nervous speech. For the young men who rehearsed their proposals for weeks and still lost their place when the moment came. For the aunts who sat by the fire with their needlework and pretended not to listen, while actually listening to everything. For the couples who navigated their wedding nights with nothing but goodwill and mutual confusion to guide them, and who somehow, working against odds that seem from here nearly impossible, came to love each other anyway. Because history may be strange and slow and deeply committed to ceremony for its own sake, but it is also proof that people are fundamentally hopeful and stubborn and kind of wonderfully ridiculous. They always have been. They always will be. Good night.